Chapter 1. The Weight of Betrayal. The Vox transmission cut through the silence of Perturabo's private study, like a blade through flesh, and for the first time in decades, the Lord of Iron felt his hands shake. Olympia had risen in rebellion. He set the data slate down with deliberate care, watching his fingers release their grip one by one. The message sat there on the brushed steel surface of his desk, the official imperial seal at the top doing nothing to soften the words beneath. Systematic uprising, coordinated resistance, imperial governance expelled from 17 major cities. The rebels flew banners marked with the old symbols of Olympian independence, symbols Perturabo himself had taught them to abandon when he'd first brought his world into the Imperium's embrace. The irony cut deeper than the betrayal itself. He had been 3 systems away, breaking the back of a Xenos fortress world that had defied Imperial compliance for 2 years, while he had spent months crafting the perfect siege to bring another world into the Emperor's light. His own people had been plotting to extinguish it. Perturabo rose from his chair and walked to the viewport, looking out at the debris field that had once been the Xenos' stronghold. His iron warriors were already cataloguing salvageable materials and planning the construction of imperial facilities on the conquered world. Efficient, thorough, loyal. Everything his birth world apparently was not. The rage hit him then. Not the cold, analytical fury he wielded in war, but something raw and personal that clawed at his chest. They had waited until he was gone, until his back was turned, until they thought themselves beyond his reach. The people he had lifted from their brutal city-states and petty wars, the world he had unified and brought into the greatest civilization humanity had ever known. They had spat in his face the moment they thought they could get away with it. His reflection stared back at him from the viewport, the face that had inspired fear and loyalty across 100 worlds. But behind it, overlapping his features like a ghost, he could see Caliphone's face, his adopted sister, who had stayed behind to help govern Olympia in his absence. The transmission had made no mention of casualties among Imperial personnel. The thought that she might be dead, or worse, that she might have joined them, sent something cold through his veins that had nothing to do with the recycled air of his flagship. My lord? Perturabo didn't turn. His reflection had been joined by another, Dantioch, one of his most trusted officers, whose scarred face carried the weight of 100 campaigns. The man had earned the right to enter without ceremony, though he rarely exercised it. "You've seen the report," Perturabo said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, my lord. The fleet stands ready for immediate departure. We can reach Olympia within the week." A week to cross the void between this shattered Xenos world and the place of his birth, to return to the mountain palaces, where he had first learned to build and destroy. A week to decide what he would do when he arrived. "The men are eager to depart," Dantioch continued, his voice carefully neutral. "They remember the honors Olympia has brought to the Legion. They wish to restore proper order." Perturabo finally turned from the viewport. Dantioch's expression was stone, but 40 years of campaigning together had taught Perturabo to read the minute tensions around his lieutenant's eyes. The Iron Warriors were angry. Their Primarch's homeworld had betrayed not just him, but them, his sons who had bled across the galaxy in Olympia's name. "Restore proper order," Perturabo repeated. "An interesting phrase, Dantioch. What does that mean, precisely?" "My lord, when the Emperor found me on Olympia, the world was drowning in its own blood. 16 separate kingdoms waging eternal war, each convinced that their neighbors were less than human. I unified them. I brought them peace. I gave them the stars." His voice carried the weight of old bitterness. "Was that not proper order?" Dantioch's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My lord, they have rejected the gift you gave them. They have spat upon your generosity and spurned the Emperor's light. This cannot stand. Cannot stand." The words echoed in Perturabo's mind as he walked past Dantioch toward the tactical display that dominated the center of his study. He touched a control surface, and the hologram shifted from the current system to show Olympia, the blue-white jewel of the Meritara cluster, its surface scarred by the elegant geometric patterns of his early fortifications. "Tell me, Dantioch, what did the Emperor teach us about rebellion?" "That it must be crushed swiftly and completely, my lord. That mercy to traitors is cruelty to the innocent who remain loyal." "And what else?" Dantioch hesitated. "My lord? When I was young, younger even than when he found me, I read every text on warfare and governance I could find in the libraries of Lokos. Do you know what I learned about rebellions, Dantioch?" "My lord, that they don't happen in a void." Perturabo's fingers moved across the display, zooming in on the major population centers of Olympia. Each was marked with the red icon of insurrection. People don't risk everything they have, don't throw their lives away against impossible odds for abstract political philosophy. They rebel when they have nothing left to lose. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the background hum of the ship's systems. Perturabo could feel his lieutenant's confusion, like a physical presence. "My lord," Dantioch said carefully, "are you suggesting that Olympia had cause for rebellion?" The question hung in the air like a blade balanced on its edge. Perturabo knew what the expected answer was, what Rogel Dawn would say, or Lehman Russ, or any of his brothers who had never doubted their place in the Emperor's vision. Rebels were rebels. Traitors were traitors. The cause was irrelevant. Only the response mattered. But Perturabo had built his reputation on seeing what others could not, on understanding the stress points and weaknesses that escaped notice until the moment of catastrophic failure. And now, staring at the crimson markers that dotted his homeworld like wounds, he found himself asking a question that felt like treason even to think. What if they did have cause? "Prepare the fleet for translation," he said finally. "But slowly, Dantioch. I want time to think during the journey." "My lord, with respect, delay is not weakness." The words came out sharper than Perturabo intended, and he saw Dantioch straighten reflexively. "I have spent my entire life learning to see battles before they are fought, to understand the ground before the first shot is fired. I will not abandon that wisdom now, even when, especially when, the enemy is my own blood." Dantioch bowed his head. "As you command, my lord." After his lieutenant left, Perturabo remained alone with the display of Olympia, watching the slow rotation of the world that had shaped him. Somewhere down there, in the mountain cities he had built with his own hands, people were flying rebel banners and speaking words of defiance. People who had known him as a child, who had watched him grow from foundling to conqueror to Primarch. People who had chosen to risk everything rather than live under the rule he had created. The rage was still there, coiled in his chest like a heated wire, but alongside it now was something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like doubt. Not doubt in his loyalty to the Emperor, that remained as solid as adamantium, but doubt in his own judgment, in the choices he had made while building his vision of order on Olympian soil. He thought of the last time he had walked through the streets of Lokos, barely a year ago. The people had cheered him then, thrown flower petals at his feet, called him their savior and their lord. But had he looked closely enough? Had he seen past the ceremony to the faces beneath? Had he seen the cost of his peace? Perturabo closed his eyes, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to remember not the moment of his triumph, but the moment before it. The Emperor, standing in the rubble of a Xeno stronghold, much like the one Perturabo had just conquered, speaking words that had seemed like simple truth at the time. Unity, my son, is not achieved through strength alone. It endures only when those who live under it believe they have something worth preserving. The memory felt like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. Unity, preservation, belief. When had the people of Olympia stopped believing? And more importantly, when had he stopped caring whether they did? Chapter 2. The Price of Understanding. The first thing Perturabo noticed as the Iron Warriors' fleet dropped out of the warp was the smoke. It rose from Olympia's surface in dark columns that twisted through the atmosphere like accusing fingers, visible even from high orbit. The tactical displays painted a grim picture. 17 major cities showing signs of civil unrest, imperial garrison facilities abandoned or destroyed, orbital traffic reduced to almost nothing. His world looked like a battlefield, and he hadn't even set foot on it yet. "Fleet deployment complete, my lord," reported Captain Crendel from the bridge of the Iron Blood. "All companies ready for immediate planetfall. Orbital bombardment coordinates have been calculated for maximum effectiveness against rebel strongholds." Perturabo stood at the primary command station, his hands clasped behind his back, as he studied the tactical displays. It would be simple enough. A few carefully placed strikes from orbit, perhaps a demonstration of overwhelming force, and the rebellion would collapse within hours. The people of Olympia knew the fury of the Fourth Legion. They had watched him unleash it on their neighbors during the Unification Wars. One show of that same devastating efficiency turned against them, and they would remember why they had knelt before him in the first place. "My lord," Crendel's voice carried the expectation of someone awaiting orders that should have already been given. "Stand down orbital bombardment," Perturabo said quietly. "All ships maintain position, but do not target population centers." The silence on the bridge was absolute. Perturabo could feel the weight of a dozen stares, the unspoken questions that his officers dared not voice. Dantioch stepped forward from his position at the communications station. "My lord, if we delay, we gather intelligence first." Perturabo's voice carried the finality of a closing vault door. "I want detailed reconnaissance of all major cities. Identify rebel leadership, assess their capabilities, determine their goals, and—" He paused, feeling the words stick in his throat like shards of glass. "I want to know casualties, imperial personnel, civilian populations, infrastructure damage, all of it." The reports came in over the following hours, each one adding another weight to the growing certainty in Perturabo's mind. The rebellion had been carefully planned and surprisingly restrained. Imperial administrative centers had been seized, not destroyed. Garrison forces had been overwhelmed, but not massacred. Most had been allowed to withdraw to designated areas. Supply depots had been captured intact, suggesting the rebels intended to maintain order rather than simply tear down what existed. This was not the work of mindless destroyers. This was the methodical action of people who understood governance. The revelation that Caliphone was alive came in the 4th hour of reconnaissance. She had been seen addressing crowds in the capital city of Lokos, standing on the same balcony where Perturabo himself had once announced Olympia's entry into the Imperium. The intelligence reports described her as one of the rebellion's primary leaders, her words carrying weight among both the common people and the displaced imperial administrators. Perturabo stared at the grainy picked capture of his adopted sister, noting how the years of his absence had aged her. There was steel in her posture, now that hadn't been there when he'd left, a bearing that spoke of someone who had been forced to make difficult decisions without guidance. She looked, he realized with a shock of recognition, exactly like their adoptive father had in his final years, worn down by responsibility, but unbowed by it. "Sir, shall I prepare an extraction team?" asked Crendel. "If she's being held by the rebels—" "She's not being held," Perturabo said. The words tasted like ashes. "She's leading them." He left the bridge without another word, retreating to his private chambers to wrestle with a truth he wasn't ready to accept. Caliphone, who had sung him to sleep when he was young, who had taught him the histories of old Olympia, who had wept with joy when he'd first been named as their father's heir, had chosen to stand against everything he had built. The personal communicator in his quarters chimed once, displaying an incoming transmission on a civilian frequency. The origin signature identified it as coming from the planetary surface, from a location in the mountains outside Lokos. For a moment, Perturabo considered ignoring it. Then, driven by a need he couldn't quite name, he opened the channel. Caliphone's face appeared on the screen, and 20 yours collapsed between them like a falling wall. "Hello, brother," she said, and her voice carried the same warmth he remembered from childhood, though now it was tempered with something that might have been sadness. "I was hoping you would come." "You were hoping I would come." Perturabo kept his own voice, carefully neutral, but he could hear the strain in it. "To what end, Caliphone? To witness your betrayal firsthand." She winced, and for a moment he saw past the leader to the sister who had once bandaged his scraped knees. To talk. Just to talk. Before whatever happens next. "Before I restore order to my world, you mean?" "Before you decide what order means." She leaned forward, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of sleepless nights and impossible choices. "Perturabo, please. Meet with me. There are things you need to understand." Every instinct screamed against it. This was how rebellions worked. They drew legitimate authority into negotiations that implied equality where none existed. They made reasonable people forget that treason was still treason, regardless of the traitor's motivations. But the woman on the screen wasn't some faceless rebel. This was Caliphone, who had been more of a mother to him than his birth mother could ever have been, who had believed in his potential when others saw only a strange, gifted child who didn't quite belong. "Where?" he asked. "The old observatory, where you used to go when you needed to think." The observatory. Perturabo closed his eyes and could see it perfectly. The ancient stone structure built into the mountainside above Lokos, its dome cracked and weathered, but still functional. He had spent countless hours there as a youth, studying the stars and dreaming of the day he would walk among them. It was neutral ground in its way. Sacred ground. "Alone," he said. "Of course." Caliphone's relief was visible. "Thank you, brother, for listening." The transmission ended, leaving Perturabo alone with the weight of what he had just agreed to do. He could imagine Antioch's reaction, Crendel's protests, the horrified expressions of his command staff, when he announced his intention to meet with rebel leadership without escort. Every principle of security and military doctrine screamed against such an action. But as he prepared to leave the ship, Perturabo found himself thinking not of military doctrine, but of a conversation from decades past. He had been perhaps 16, wrestling with some problem of engineering that had seemed insurmountable at the time. His adoptive father had found him in the workshops, surrounded by failed prototypes and growing frustration. "You're thinking like a conqueror," the old man had said, settling into the chair beside Perturabo's workbench. "Sometimes, to truly understand a problem, you must think like a seeker of truth instead." "What's the difference?" young Perturabo had asked. A conqueror approaches a problem already knowing what victory should look like. A seeker of truth approaches it ready to learn that victory might be something entirely different from what they expected. Now, as Perturabo donned a simple robe over his armor and prepared to descend to Olympia's surface, he wondered if he was about to learn the difference firsthand. The journey to the observatory took him through the city of his youth, and what he saw there stopped him cold. The streets were quiet, but not empty. People moved about their business with the careful purposefulness of those living under uncertain authority. But they weren't cowering. They weren't displaying the hollow-eyed desperation of a populace ground down by oppression. They looked, Perturabo realized with growing unease, like people who had something to lose. The observatory itself was much as he remembered it, though someone had clearly been maintaining it in his absence. The stone steps were clear of debris, the door well-oiled. Inside, the ancient mechanical systems hummed with quiet efficiency, and the dome above had been opened to reveal the star-scattered sky of Olympian night. Caliphone was waiting for him beside the great telescope, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned upward toward the stars. She had aged, yes, but gracefully. Authority suited her in a way that surprised him. She carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I used to wonder," she said without turning, "if you ever looked back at Olympia when you were out there among the stars, if you remembered us." I remembered. The words came out harsher than he'd intended. I remembered the world I left behind. Peaceful, prosperous, grateful. Grateful. She turned to face him then, and he saw tears in her eyes. "Oh, Perturabo, we were grateful. For so long, we were grateful. Do you know what changed that?" He didn't answer, because he was afraid he was beginning to. "Time," she continued. "Time, and the slow realization that gratitude had become the only currency we were allowed to possess." She gestured toward the city below them, visible through the observatory's great window. "Do you see those lights? Each one represents a family, a life, a story. And for 20 years, those stories have been written by people who never asked what the families wanted to say." "I brought peace to this world," Perturabo said. But even to his own ears, the word sounded defensive rather than declarative. "You brought your peace to this world," Caliphone corrected gently. "And it was a beautiful peace, brother. Truly. The wars ended. The killing stopped. Children grew up without fear of raiders or invasion. But," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "peace imposed is not the same as peace chosen. And over time, the difference matters more than you might think." Perturabo felt something cold settling in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your peace required us to become smaller than we were, to accept that our voices mattered less than our compliance, to raise our children to believe that their dreams were less important than their duties." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. "I'm saying that 20 years of watching our brightest suns disappear into your legion, of seeing our resources flow outward to fund wars we had no voice in choosing, of living under laws we had no hand in writing. 20 years of that changes a people, Perturabo. It makes them forget why they should be grateful." The words hit him like physical blows. He wanted to deny them, to point out the improvements in infrastructure, the increased standard of living, the protection of the imperial umbrella. But looking at Caliphone's face, this woman who had never lied to him, not once in all their years together, he found himself asking a different question. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "We want to choose," she said simply. Not to leave the Imperium, we understand what that would mean, what would come for us, but to have a voice in how we serve it. To know that our sons who join your legion do so because they choose the honor, not because they're selected by quotas we have no control over, to have representatives in the decisions that govern our lives. It was treason, not the overt kind that called for orbital bombardment, but the subtle kind that questioned the very foundations of imperial authority. And yet, as Perturabo listened to his sister's words, he found himself remembering not the Emperor's directives on planetary governance, but earlier conversations, talks about unity and purpose, about building something that would last, not because it was imposed, but because it was believed in. "You're asking me to give up my authority over my own home world," he said. "I'm asking you to share it," Caliphone replied, "the way our father taught you to share power with those who served under you, the way you've always shared authority with your most trusted officers. My officers earned that trust through service and loyalty. And we haven't?" Her voice rose slightly, the first real emotion she'd shown. 20 years of sending our sons to die in your wars. 20 years of feeding our resources into your conquests. 20 years of building exactly what you asked us to build. How much service do we need to provide before we're allowed to be partners instead of subjects? The question hung between them, like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Perturabo found himself thinking of the tactical displays he'd studied on the journey here, the careful restraint the rebels had shown, the infrastructure they'd preserved, the imperial personnel they'd allowed to withdraw safely. These weren't the actions of people bent on destruction. These were the actions of people trying to build something new while causing as little damage as possible to what already existed. People who had learned statecraft from watching him. "If I were to consider such a thing," he said slowly, "what would it look like?" Caliphone's face brightened with hope, so sudden and radiant that it almost hurt to look at. "A council," she said quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind. "Representatives from each major city and province, working with your appointed governors, input on recruitment policies, a voice in resource allocation. Not control, partnership. And the rebellion ends the moment you agree to negotiate in good faith." She leaned forward, urgent now. "Perturabo, the people respect you, love you even, despite everything. They just want to feel like they matter to the story they're helping to write." As Perturabo looked at his sister, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since arriving, he saw something that made his decision for him. She had the same expression she'd worn as a child when she'd brought him broken toys or wounded animals, asking if he could fix them. The same combination of hope and fear, faith and vulnerability. She believed he could fix this. More than that, she believed he would want to. "Very well," he said, and watched 20 years of tension drain out of her shoulders. "We'll try your partnership, Caliphone, but if it fails, if this trust is betrayed—" "It won't be," she said quickly. "I promise you, brother, it won't be." As they stood together in the observatory, where he had first learned to dream of the stars, Perturabo felt something shifting inside him. A certainty that had guided him for decades was cracking, revealing questions he had never thought to ask. Questions about the difference between ruling and leading, between compliance and loyalty, between building something that would last and building something worth preserving. Questions that, he was beginning to suspect, might determine not just the fate of Olympia, but the kind of son he would be to the emperor who had found him among these same stars all those years ago. Chapter 3. Rebuilding What Was Broken. 3 weeks after the conversation in the observatory, Perturabo stood before the assembled Iron Warriors' command staff and watched their carefully controlled expressions crack. "Amnesty," repeated Captain Crendel, the word leaving his mouth like something that tasted foul. "For rebels, for traitors who raised arms against imperial authority. For citizens of my world who sought redress of legitimate grievances," Perturabo corrected, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, despite the challenge implicit in his words. Grievances that, upon investigation, proved to have substantial merit. The silence in the briefing chamber was deafening. 23 officers of the 4th Legion, veterans of 100 campaigns, stared at their Primarch as if he had announced his intention to abandon the Great Crusade and become a farmer. Perturabo could read their thoughts in the tension around their eyes, the set of their shoulders, the way their hands unconsciously drifted toward weapon hilts. He was disappointing them. More than that, he was frightening them. "My lord," said Captain Barossus, his voice carefully measured, "the precedent this sets. Other worlds may see Olympian amnesty as imperial weakness. They may believe rebellion is a viable path to—" "To what, Captain? To having their voices heard? To participating in the governance of their own lives?" Perturabo's tone sharpened. "If that terrifies the Imperium, perhaps we should examine what we've built instead of simply crushing those who question it." Another silence, this one edged with something that might have been shock. Dantioch, standing at the back of the group, shifted slightly, not quite stepping forward, but making his presence felt. The veteran officer's scarred face remained impassive, but Perturabo had fought beside him long enough to recognize support when he saw it. "The men are concerned, my lord," offered Captain Harcourt, choosing his words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. "They joined the Legion to serve the Emperor's vision of unity through strength. This new approach serves that vision more completely than what came before," Perturabo said. "Unity imposed through fear is not unity at all. It's temporary compliance, built on a foundation of resentment. True unity requires willing participation, not merely grudging submission." He could see them struggling with the concept. These were warriors who had spent their careers reducing complex political situations to simple binary choices: comply or be destroyed. The idea that there might be a third path, one that required patience and compromise instead of overwhelming force, challenged everything they thought they understood about effective governance. "Sir," Captain Crendel said, his jaw tight with suppressed frustration, "with respect, the Crusade has brought compliance to 1,000 worlds through the application of measured force. The imperial model works. Why risk changing what has proven successful?" "Because success is not the same as sustainability." Perturabo moved to the tactical display that dominated the center of the chamber, calling up a holographic representation of Olympia. The planet rotated slowly, its surface marked with the geometric patterns of his early fortifications, structures that had once seemed like permanent monuments to imperial authority. A building may stand for centuries through pure structural integrity, but if its foundations shift, if the ground beneath it changes, even the strongest materials will eventually fail. He gestured to the display, and new markers appeared, red indicators showing the sites of recent unrest, the cities where rebellion had first taken root. "I built my peace on Olympia through superior force and careful engineering. I thought that was enough. I was wrong." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Several of his officers exchanged glances, and Perturabo could practically hear their thoughts. If their Primarch could be wrong about this, what else might he be wrong about? The certainty that had guided the 4th Legion for decades was cracking, and none of them knew how to shore up the foundation. "What exactly are you proposing, my lord?" asked Dantioch, his voice cutting through the tension with the clarity of someone genuinely seeking understanding, rather than expressing doubt. "Structural modification instead of demolition," Perturabo replied. "We rebuild the relationship between Olympia and the Imperium with new materials, trust instead of fear, partnership instead of domination, willing service instead of extracted compliance." "And if it fails?" Krendel's question carried the weight of someone already certain it would. "Then we will have learned something valuable about the limits of our current methods," Perturabo said. "But I don't believe it will fail, because I've seen the alternative. The people of Olympia want to serve the Emperor's vision. They've proven that through 20 years of sacrifice. They simply want to understand their place in it instead of being told to accept it blindly." The discussion continued for another hour, ranging across practical implementation details and theoretical frameworks. Some officers, led by Dantioch, and including several company commanders who had served on garrison duty across various compliant worlds, showed cautious interest in the new approach. Others remained skeptical, their concerns centering on the precedent such policies might set across the broader Imperium. But as the meeting concluded and his officers filed out to brief their subordinates, Perturabo found himself thinking not about their doubts, but about the conversation he'd had with Caliphone that morning. "The people are starting to believe," she had told him as they walked through the rebuilt administrative district of Lokos. "They're participating in the planning sessions, volunteering for infrastructure projects, offering suggestions for improving resource allocation. It's as if the city has remembered how to think for itself." The change was visible in ways both large and small. Work crews laboring on reconstruction projects moved with purpose rather than resignation. Citizens approached Iron Warriors patrols with questions and requests instead of fearful avoidance. Children played games that involved building and creating rather than hiding and surviving. Most tellingly, recruitment numbers for the Legion auxiliary forces had actually increased since the amnesty. Young Olympians who had grown up during the rebellion were volunteering to serve, drawn by the promise that their service would be valued rather than simply extracted. It was working. The risk he had taken, the gamble that trust could accomplish what force alone could not, was paying dividends in ways he had never anticipated. That evening, as Perturabo worked in his private study, reviewing the detailed reports from the governance transition, a priority communication alert chimed on his personal Vox system. The encryption signatures identified it as coming directly from Terra, carrying the highest levels of imperial authority. "Lord Perturabo," came the familiar voice of Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right hand. "I trust this message finds you well. The Emperor requires your immediate attention regarding a situation of utmost urgency." Perturabo straightened in his chair. Direct communications from Terra were rare, typically reserved for the most critical imperial business. He activated the full security protocols and opened the channel. "I am at the Emperor's service, Lord Malcador," he replied. "Excellent. A situation has developed in the Istvan system. War Master Horus has apparently moved against Imperial compliance officers and declared his independence from Imperial authority. The magnitude of this betrayal cannot be overstated." The words hit Perturabo like a physical blow. Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's chosen son, the brother who had stood beside the Emperor since the earliest days of the Crusade, had turned traitor. The implications were staggering, not just militarily but psychologically. If Horus could fall, what did that say about the stability of the entire imperial project? "The Emperor has ordered a punitive expedition to Istvan V," Malcador continued. 7 legions will participate in this action. The Iron Warriors are to serve in the second wave, providing siege expertise and heavy assault capabilities. Your fleet will rendezvous with the expedition at the designated coordinates within 1 standard month. 7 legions. The scope of the deployment spoke to how seriously Terra was taking this threat. Perturabo's mind immediately began calculating logistics, supply requirements, strategic approaches to siege warfare on an unfamiliar world. But underneath the tactical planning, a deeper current of thought was flowing. He had just spent weeks learning the cost of ruling through fear and force alone. Now the Emperor was asking him to apply exactly that approach to his own brother, a brother who, for whatever reason, had chosen rebellion over loyalty. The parallel to Olympia's situation was not lost on him. "Lord Malcador," Perturabo said carefully, "has any attempt been made to understand the War Master's grievances, to determine if negotiation might be possible?" The pause that followed was long enough to make Perturabo wonder if the communication had failed. When Malcador spoke again, his voice carried a note of surprise that was almost audible. "Negotiation, Lord Perturabo. With a son who has murdered imperial representatives and declared himself in open rebellion against his father's authority? What could possibly justify such treachery?" "Of course, Lord Malcador. Forgive the question." Perturabo felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized how his words must have sounded. The Iron Warriors will be ready for deployment within the specified time frame. Excellent. Detailed operational briefs will follow through standard channels. The Emperor's will be done. The connection ended, leaving Perturabo alone with the weight of what he had just learned. Horus, brilliant, charismatic, loyal Horus, had chosen the path Perturabo himself had rejected just weeks ago. The path of destroying what existed rather than working to improve it. But even as he began to plan for the deployment to Istvan Firth, Perturabo found himself troubled by questions he couldn't quite suppress. What had driven Horus to such a desperate choice? What grievances could be so severe that the War Master, the Emperor's most trusted son, would risk everything in rebellion? And perhaps most troubling of all, if Perturabo had not learned the lessons of Olympia, if he had responded to his world's rebellion with the fury and force his officers had expected, would he now be standing alongside Horus instead of preparing to fight against him? The thought was treason, even to consider. But as Perturabo stared out at the lights of Lokos below, lights that now represented hope and partnership instead of mere compliance, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that the war he was about to fight might be more complicated than anyone on Terra understood. In the distance, he could see construction crews working by floodlight to complete one of the new civic centers, a project planned jointly by imperial administrators and elected Olympian representatives. The building was taking shape exactly as designed, but the process of its creation was entirely different from anything the Iron Warriors had built before. Different, but stronger. Built to last, not because it was imposed, but because it was wanted. As Perturabo began drafting deployment orders for his legion, he found himself hoping that whatever had driven Horus to rebellion, there might still be time to build something better from its ashes. But first, the rebellion would have to be stopped, and that task, for better or worse, now fell to him and his brothers. The irony was not lost on him that the first test of his new understanding of leadership would come not on Olympia, but in the crucible of a war against the very brother who had shown him the stakes of getting it wrong. Chapter 4. The Call to Istvan. The tactical display in Perturabo's private strategium showed the disposition of forces for the Istvan V operation in precise, three-dimensional detail, and something about it made his teeth ache. 7 legions, the Iron Hands, Salamanders and Raven Guard forming the initial assault wave, the Iron Warriors, Word Bearers, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion comprising the second wave, designated as support and reinforcement. On the surface, it was exactly the kind of overwhelming force deployment that had characterized the most successful operations of the Great Crusade, more than sufficient to bring even a rebellious Primarch to heel. But Perturabo had spent 40 years studying the mathematics of warfare, and the mathematics here were wrong. "Analysis complete, my lord," reported D'Antioch, looking up from his own tactical workstation. "Supply projections, transit times, coordination protocols, all standard for a multi-legion operation of this scope." "Standard," Perturabo murmured, his augmented vision passing data streams that would have overwhelmed an unenhanced human mind. "Yes, it's all perfectly standard. That's the problem." He manipulated the holographic display, rotating it to examine the force deployment from different angles. The first wave was composed of legions known for their frontal assault capabilities and tactical flexibility. The second wave included specialists in siege warfare, terror tactics, infiltration, and— what? The word-bearers were scholars and zealots, effective in their own way, but hardly the obvious choice for siege support. "My lord?" "Tell me, D'Antioch, if you were planning an operation to capture or kill a rebellious Primarch, how would you deploy 7 legions?" His lieutenant studied the display with the practiced eye of someone who had planned more campaigns than most generals would see in a lifetime. Maximum operational flexibility in the first wave, iron hands for direct assault, salamanders for infantry support and urban warfare, Raven Guard for reconnaissance and flanking maneuvers. The second wave— He paused, his scarred brow furrowing. "I would want siege specialists and heavy assault troops for the follow-up. Iron warriors, certainly. Imperial fists would be ideal for coordinated siege operations, but they're committed to terror. Iron hands and salamanders have sufficient siege capability that additional specialists might be redundant, unless— Unless what? Unless the operation is expected to require capabilities beyond siege warfare." D'Antioch's voice carried the uncertainty of someone working through a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit. Terror tactics for population control, perhaps. Infiltration specialists for intelligence gathering. But that would suggest a campaign of longer duration than a simple compliance action. Perturabo nodded slowly. The same conclusion he had reached, though from a different, analytical path. Either whoever had planned this operation expected significantly more resistance than a single rebellious legion should provide, or they had information about the situation that wasn't being shared with the participating forces. "Continue preparation for deployment," he told D'Antioch, "but I want detailed contingency plans for extended operations. Assume we may be on Istvan Fef for significantly longer than the briefings suggest." After his lieutenant departed, Perturabo remained alone with the tactical display, turning the problem over in his mind like a complex engineering challenge. There were too many variables, too many unknowns, the kind of incomplete information that led to strategic disasters and unnecessary casualties. The private communication alert that chimed an hour later carried an encryption signature he recognized but hadn't expected to see. Horus's personal cipher, one reserved for communications between the Primarchs themselves. Perturabo hesitated before opening the channel. Direct communication with a declared rebel was technically a breach of protocol, though one that could be justified if it yielded intelligence about the enemy's intentions or capabilities. But something about the timing, coming so soon after his analysis of the Istvan 05 deployment, made his instincts prickle with warning. He opened the channel. Horus appeared in holographic projection, and the first thing Perturabo noticed was how little his brother had changed. No signs of madness or corruption, no obvious indicators of the kind of psychological breakdown that might drive a Primarch to rebellion. If anything, Horus looked calmer than Perturabo had seen him in years, his bearing carrying the confidence of someone who had made a difficult decision and found peace in its consequences. "Brother," Horus said, his voice warm with genuine affection, "I hoped we might speak before you arrive at Istvan Fifth. There are things you need to understand." "The only thing I need to understand," Perturabo replied carefully, "is why the War Master chose rebellion over loyalty." Horus's smile was sad rather than bitter. "The same reason, I suspect, that you chose mercy over vengeance on Olympia. Because sometimes, brother, loyalty to principles requires disloyalty to authority." The words hit Perturabo like a physical blow. How did Horus know about Olympia? The official reports had described the suppression of a minor uprising, with no mention of amnesty or governmental restructuring. Had there been intelligence leaks, surveillance, or simply the kind of informal information networks that existed between the legions? "I don't know what you've heard about Olympia," Perturabo said. "But I know you chose to listen instead of destroy," Horus interrupted gently. "I know you discovered that the people you thought had betrayed you were actually trying to save something you had built together. I know you found a way to be the leader your world needed instead of the conqueror it feared." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "And I know that choice has made you question other assumptions about authority and loyalty." It was true, all of it, and the accuracy of Horus's assessment was more unnerving than any display of rebellion would have been. This wasn't the ranting of a madman or the posturing of an ambitious usurper. This was someone who understood exactly what Perturabo had been through and why it mattered. "What do you want, Horus?" "I want to offer you the same choice you gave your people on Olympia," Horus said. "The chance to be part of something built on willing cooperation instead of imposed compliance. The chance to help create an empire that serves its citizens instead of demanding that citizens serve it blindly. You're talking about rebellion against the Emperor, against our father. I'm talking about revolution, Perturabo, about building something better than what we inherited." Horus's voice carried the passion of absolute conviction. "Look at the deployment for Istvan Fifth, 7 legions to bring down one. Do you know why so many? Because the Emperor believes in overwhelming force as the solution to every problem. Because the idea that someone might have legitimate grievances, might deserve to be heard rather than simply crushed, is inconceivable to him." Perturabo felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You believe your grievances are legitimate?" "I believe our grievances are legitimate. Yours, mine, half our brothers. We've spent 2 centuries building an empire that enriches Terra while the rest of humanity serves its needs. We've conquered worlds that asked only for autonomy and forced them to accept subjugation. We've become instruments of oppression, Perturabo, and we've called it civilization." The argument was seductive in its logic, terrifying in its implications, because there was truth in it. Perturabo had seen that truth on Olympia, had grappled with its consequences for weeks. The Emperor's vision of human unity was magnificent in its scope, but its implementation had often been brutal in its simplicity. "And your solution is civil war? Brother fighting brother across the galaxy?" "My solution is offering choice," Horus said. "Join me willingly, and help me build something better. Remain loyal to our father, and I'll ensure you're treated with the honor due a worthy opponent when this is over. But don't allow yourself to be used as a tool of oppression simply because you've always been told that's what loyalty requires. You're asking me to betray my oaths. I'm asking you to honor the spirit of those oaths instead of their letter. You swore to serve humanity, brother, to build something worthy of the species we're meant to protect. If that goal can be achieved better outside the current imperial structure than within it? Which oath takes precedence? The question hung in the air between them, like a blade balanced on its edge. Perturabo could see the logic of Horus's position, could understand how someone might arrive at such conclusions through careful reasoning rather than simple ambition or madness. And that understanding was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. "I need to think," Perturabo said finally. "Of course. But don't take too long, brother. The deployment to Istvan Fev isn't what it appears to be. There are others among our brothers who share my vision, and when the time comes to choose sides, I'd prefer to count you among my allies rather than my enemies." The communication ended, leaving Perturabo alone with the weight of what he had just heard. Others among their brothers. The deployment wasn't what it appeared to be. The implications were staggering. Not a single rebellious Primarch, but a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple legions, the kind of betrayal that would tear the Imperium apart. He thought about Olympia, about the conversation in the observatory, about Caliphone's words regarding the difference between imposed peace and chosen unity. He thought about the people who had risked everything to seek a voice in their own governance, and how their courage had ultimately made the world stronger rather than weaker. But he also thought about the Emperor, not the distant authority figure of official doctrine, but the being who had found him on Olympia and offered him a place among the stars, who had given him brothers and a purpose greater than any he could have imagined, who had trusted him with responsibilities that spanned galaxies and shaped the destiny of entire species. There was truth in Horus's words, but there was also truth in the alternative. The Emperor's vision was flawed, perhaps, but it was also magnificent, and more importantly, it was fixable, perfectible. The lessons of Olympia had proven that change was possible within the existing structure, if one had the wisdom to pursue it and the courage to risk the attempt. Rising from his command chair, Perturabo moved to the communications station and began encoding a message with the highest possible encryption protocols. Not to Horus, whose offer still echoed in his mind like a half-remembered song. Not to his officers, who would need to know but couldn't be told until he was certain of the consequences. To Malkador the Sigillite, to the Emperor's right hand, who would understand the implications of what Perturabo was about to report. Who would know how to transform intelligence into action, warning into preparation, revelation into salvation. The message was brief, its contents devastating. "Lord Malkador, intelligence suggests Istvan V deployment compromised. Multiple legions potentially involved in rebellion beyond War Master Horus. Recommend immediate security review of all participating forces. Will maintain operational security and await instructions. Loyote Milai, Perturabo." He transmitted the message and then sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of what he had just done settle around him like a cloak. In choosing to warn Malkador instead of accepting Horus's offer, he had chosen the Emperor's vision over his brother's revolution. He had chosen to work for change within the system rather than to tear it down and rebuild from scratch. But more than that, he had chosen to be the kind of leader Olympia had taught him to be, one who faced difficult problems with wisdom rather than force, who sought to heal rather than to harm, who believed that loyalty meant serving ideals rather than simply obeying authority. Outside his viewport, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and somewhere among them lay Istvan Vah, a world that would soon become the crucible in which the fate of the galaxy would be decided. But for the first time since receiving the deployment orders, Perturabo felt something other than dread at the thought of what lay ahead. He felt hope. not for an easy victory or a simple resolution, but for the possibility that wisdom learned through mercy might prove stronger than ambition fed by spite. That the choice he had made in that observatory on Olympia might echo across the galaxy in ways he was only beginning to understand. The war that was coming would test everything he believed about loyalty and leadership. But thanks to his sister's courage and his own willingness to listen, he would face that test as someone who understood the difference between ruling and serving, between commanding obedience and earning loyalty. And perhaps, if fortune favored the prepared mind, that difference might be enough to save not just the Imperium, but the brotherhood he valued more than life itself. Chapter 5. The Loyal Opposition. The silence in the Imperial Palace's highest strategic council chamber was the kind that preceded either revelation or execution, and Perturabo wasn't entirely certain which he was about to experience. Malcador the Sigillite sat at the head of the obsidian table, his fingers steepled before him, in a gesture that managed to convey both deep thought and barely restrained concern. To his right, Rogel Dawn's yellow-armored bulk radiated the kind of controlled tension that Perturabo recognized from 100 siege warfare conferences the moment before the first wall fell, when everything balanced on the edge of violence. The handful of other figures present, senior custodians, representatives of the various imperial military branches, and cryptographic specialists whose names Perturabo didn't know, maintained the rigid stillness of people who understood they were witnessing history being written in real time. "The intelligence you've provided," Malcador said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "has been verified through multiple independent channels. The scope of the conspiracy is extensive." Perturabo felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How extensive?" "Beyond what your brother Horus revealed to you, though his information was accurate as far as it went. We now believe 4 of the 7 legions assigned to the Istvan V deployment have been compromised. 4 legions. More than half the second wave, and potentially representing hundreds of thousands of Astartes who would be firing on their own brothers when the moment came. The scale of the betrayal was staggering, but what truly made Perturabo's augmented heart skip was the mathematical implication. If 4 legions in the second wave were traitors, and Horus controlled forces on the ground, the loyalist first wave would be walking into the most perfectly engineered massacre in the history of warfare. "Which legions?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Word-bearers, Night Lords, Alpha Legion," Malcador replied. "And according to our intelligence, the Iron Warriors." The accusation hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Perturabo could feel the weight of every gaze in the chamber, the careful attention of minds that had just learned to suspect one of the Emperor's own sons of treason. The irony was bitter enough to taste. His warning had saved the loyalist cause, but it had also painted him as a potential traitor in the eyes of those he'd sought to protect. "The Iron Warriors remain loyal to the Emperor," Perturabo said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that brooked no argument. "I am loyal to the Emperor." "Are you?" The question came from Rogel Dawn, and it carried decades of rivalry and mutual suspicion distilled into 2 simple words. "Because the evidence suggests that your legion has been marked for recruitment by the traitors. Your home world recently experienced what official reports describe as a minor uprising. And now, conveniently, you arrive with intelligence that positions you perfectly to gain the trust of the loyalist command structure while maintaining credibility with the traitors." The logic was flawless, Perturabo had to admit. If he had been planning such a deception himself, he might have constructed it exactly this way. The problem was that the truth, that his experience with Mercy on Olympia had taught him lessons that inoculated him against Horus's corruption, was far more complex than anything that would fit comfortably into a strategic briefing. "You suspect me of orchestrating a rebellion on my own world to provide cover for eventual treachery," Perturabo said, addressing Dawn directly. "An interesting theory, brother. Tell me, do you believe I murdered several thousand of my own citizens and destabilized an entire sector simply to establish credentials as a potential traitor?" "I believe," Dawn replied with the steady certainty that had always characterized his pronouncements, "that traitors are capable of any atrocity if it serves their ultimate goals. The question is what your ultimate goals truly are." Before Perturabo could respond, the great doors of the chamber swung open with the whisper-quiet precision of mechanisms maintained by the finest artificers in the Imperium. The figure who entered needed no introduction, even without the physical presence that filled rooms like a gravitational field, even without the golden armor that caught light from sources that shouldn't exist. Every person in the chamber would have known the Emperor of Mankind by the simple fact that reality seemed more real in his presence. "My lord," Malcador said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of someone who had performed this gesture 10,000 times. "We were not expecting. Peace, old friend." The Emperor's voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the merely audible. "This matter requires my direct attention." He moved to the center of the chamber, and Perturabo felt the familiar sensation of being studied by an intelligence that had looked upon the birth and death of civilizations. But this time, the examination felt different. Not the casual assessment of a father evaluating a son's progress, but the intense scrutiny of someone seeking to map the very foundations of another being's soul. "Perturabo," the Emperor said, and in that single word, Perturabo heard both question and invitation. "Approach." As Perturabo stood and walked toward his father, he was acutely aware of the weight of history pressing down on this moment. In the space of a few heartbeats, the future of the Imperium would be decided not by armies or fleets, but by the judgment of one being upon the loyalty of another. Everything, the Great Crusade, the dream of human unity, the survival of the species itself, hung in the balance. The Emperor reached out and placed one gauntleted hand on Perturabo's shoulder, and suddenly the world exploded into meaning, not sensation. Perturabo had experienced psychic contact before, and this was something far more fundamental. It was as if every thought he had ever had, every decision he had ever made, every moment of doubt or certainty or hope or despair was being examined and evaluated by a consciousness vast enough to hold the patterns of an entire galaxy. He felt the Emperor's awareness moving through the landscape of his mind like light through a prism, revealing truths that even Perturabo himself hadn't fully understood. The conversation in the observatory with Caliphone, the choice to show mercy instead of vengeance, the slow, painful realization that true strength came from building consent rather than imposing compliance. The moment when Horus's offer had seemed most tempting, and the deeper moment when the lessons of Olympia had given him the wisdom to refuse it. Through it all he felt the Emperor's surprise, not at his loyalty, which had apparently never been in question, but at the path by which that loyalty had been strengthened. The idea that mercy could be a source of strategic advantage, that listening to grievances could reveal solutions rather than weaknesses, seemed to resonate through the Emperor's consciousness like a note struck on an instrument that had long been silent. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds. When it ended, Perturabo staggered slightly, not from physical exhaustion, but from the sheer intellectual vertigo of having his entire being evaluated and approved by the most powerful mind in human history. "He is loyal," the Emperor announced to the chamber, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that made further discussion irrelevant. "More than loyal. He has become wise, and wisdom, properly applied, may be exactly what we need to turn this crisis to our advantage." The tension in the room shifted, though it didn't entirely disappear. Dawn's posture remained rigid, but his expression had moved from suspicion to grudging acceptance. Malcador leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of someone whose judgment had been vindicated. "What do you propose, my lord?" asked one of the custodians. "Perturabo will proceed with the deployment to Istvan Fifth as planned," the Emperor replied. "His legion will maintain the facade of potential traitor recruitment, allowing the conspirators to believe their deception remains intact. But when the moment comes to choose sides, the Iron Warriors will stand with loyalty instead of rebellion." "A dangerous gambit," Dawn observed. "If the Iron Warriors' allegiance is revealed too early, the entire operation could collapse. If it's revealed too late, they may be caught in crossfire from their own allies." "Which is why the timing must be perfect," the Emperor agreed, "and why Perturabo himself must take personal command of the critical moment. Are you prepared for such a responsibility, my son?" The weight of the question went far beyond its simple words. Perturabo was being asked to place himself at the center of the most dangerous battlefield in Imperial history, to maintain a deception that could be shattered by a single misplaced word or action, to risk not just his own life, but the future of his entire legion on a strategy that depended on split-second timing and perfect execution. "I am," he said, and meant it. "Then we have work to do," Malcador said, calling up holographic displays that showed the current disposition of forces throughout the Istvan system. "The modification of our battle plans must be subtle enough to avoid detection, while comprehensive enough to account for the betrayal. We'll need contingencies for every possible scenario." The next several hours passed in intense strategic planning, modified supply routes that would ensure Loyalist forces had access to ammunition and support, even if their supposed allies turned against them. Communication protocols that would allow rapid coordination once the deception was revealed. Extraction plans for key personnel if the worst-case scenarios came to pass. But through it all, Perturabo found his thoughts drifting not to tactical considerations, but to personal ones. To Caliphone, who would be waiting on Olympia for word of his survival. To the Iron Warriors, who would follow him into battle without knowing they were being asked to preserve a lie that could get them all killed. To the brothers he would be fighting against, Horus, whose offer had been both terrible and terribly reasonable, the other Primarchs, who had chosen revolution over evolution. "My lord," he said, during a brief pause in the planning, addressing the Emperor directly, "may I request one day before deployment? There are personal matters I need to address." The Emperor studied him with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. "Your home world? My sister. She deserves to know what I'm about to risk, what we're all about to risk." "One day," the Emperor agreed. "But Perturabo, this may indeed be farewell. The path you've chosen to walk leads into the heart of the greatest betrayal in human history. Even with all our preparations, there are no guarantees." "I understand, my lord." Perturabo bowed his head slightly, acknowledging both the honor and the burden of what he had accepted. "But some things are worth the risk. Some fights are worth having, even if you might lose them." "Indeed." The Emperor's expression carried what might have been paternal pride. "Go then. Say your farewells. And when you return, we will finish what your wisdom has begun." As Perturabo left the council chamber and made his way toward the transport that would carry him back to Olympia, he found himself thinking not about the battle ahead, but about the conversation that had started this entire sequence of events. Caliphone's words about choosing to be the leader Olympia needed instead of the general the crusade demanded. He still wasn't sure he understood the full implications of what he had learned from that choice. But as he prepared to put his life and his legion at risk for the sake of an empire that was finally learning the difference between ruling and serving, he thought he might be beginning to. The transport lifted off from Terra's surface into the star-scattered darkness of space, carrying him toward what might be his final conversation with the person who had taught him that mercy could be stronger than vengeance, that trust could be more powerful than fear. And somewhere ahead in the void, Istvan Fi waited, the world where the future of humanity would be decided by the choices made by brothers who had once stood united against the darkness, but who now prepared to test whether love could prove stronger than ambition, whether wisdom could overcome spite, whether the dream of unity could survive the reality of civil war. Chapter 6. The Broken Ambush. The surface of Istvan V burned beneath a sky the color of dried blood, and Perturabo felt the weight of history pressing down on him like the atmosphere of a dying world. From his command position in the Iron Warrior's lead Thunderhawk, he could see the first wave of the assault unfolding exactly as the tactical projections had predicted. The Iron Hands had struck hard and fast at the primary fortifications, Ferrus Manus leading his sons in the kind of frontal assault that had broken 100 worlds. The Salamanders advanced, with their characteristic methodical precision, Vulcan's massive form visible even from altitude as he carved through enemy positions with flame and fury. The Raven Guard moved like shadows given substance, Korax and his warriors striking at weak points and supply lines with surgical efficiency. It was beautiful in its way, the perfect coordination of 3 legion doctrines working in harmony to achieve a single goal. It was also doomed to become the greatest betrayal in human history if Perturabo failed to execute his part of the plan properly. Second wave descent commences in 60 seconds, reported Captain D'Antioch over the Vox. Around them, the Iron Warriors' fleet moved into position alongside their supposed allies, the Word-Bearers, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion. 4 legions descending to support their loyal brothers against a rebellious warmaster. 4 legions, 3 of which believed they were about to complete the most perfectly orchestrated massacre in military history. Perturabo activated his personal Vox channel, the one that connected him directly to his most trusted captains. "Iron Resolve," he said quietly, using the code phrase they had rehearsed a dozen times during the journey from Terra. "Execute Olympian protocols on my mark." The acknowledgements came back immediately. D'Antioch, Harcourt, Berossus, and 16 other company commanders who had been briefed on their true mission. Not the full truth. That was too dangerous to share even with his most loyal officers. But enough truth. The second wave contained traitors. The Iron Warriors would turn on them instead of the Loyalists. The future of the Imperium depended on perfect timing and absolute commitment. 30 seconds to touchdown, D'Antioch reported. Through the Thunderhawk's viewing portal, Perturabo could see the battlefield spreading out below them in all its terrible glory. The first wave had succeeded beyond even optimistic projections. Horus's defensive positions were cracking, his forces falling back toward the central fortress complex. In another hour, perhaps 2, the rebels would be broken entirely. Unless the second wave did what they were supposed to do. "Word-bearers are taking position on the eastern flank," reported the tactical officer. "Alpha Legion moving to secure the northern approach. Night Lords deploying for terror tactics against civilian populations." Perfect. Exactly where the modified battle plans had projected they would be. Scattered across the battlefield, confident in their superiority, unprepared for the possibility that their carefully orchestrated betrayal might itself be betrayed. 15 seconds. Perturabo closed his eyes and thought of Caliphone, of the conversation they'd had before his departure from Olympia. She had embraced him at the landing platform, tears streaming down her face, and whispered words that still echoed in his mind. "Come back to us, brother. Come back and help us build the world we dreamed of." Touchdown. The Thunderhawk's assault ramp dropped, and Perturabo strode out onto the surface of Istvan Phi with his command squad at his heels. Around them, hundreds of iron warriors were deploying from their transports, moving with the practiced efficiency of a legion that had perfected the art of siege warfare across 2 centuries of conquest. To any observer, including the word-bearers positioning themselves 500 meters to the east, it would look exactly like a standard Legion deployment. Secure the landing zone, establish communication with Allied forces, coordinate with the overall battle plan. There was nothing in the Iron Warriors' movements to suggest that they were about to rewrite the course of human history. "My lord," Dantioch's voice crackled over the Vox. "Iron Hands are requesting support at grid reference 77 Alpha. They've encountered heavier resistance than expected." "Acknowledged," Perturabo replied, his voice carrying across the command frequency that connected all second-wave forces. "Iron Warriors moving to support. Word-bearers, maintain overwatch on our eastern approach." The response came back from the word-bearers' command element with exactly the kind of smug confidence Perturabo had expected. "Understood, brother. We have your back." "Yes," Perturabo thought grimly. "You do indeed." The Iron Warriors advanced across the broken terrain of Istvan V in perfect order, their heavy weapons teams deploying to provide covering fire, their assault companies moving with the mechanical precision that had earned them their reputation as the finest siege troops in the Imperium. To the untrained eye, it would look like any of the countless advances they had made during the Great Crusade. But Perturabo's trained eye could see the subtle differences, the way his tactical squads were positioned to provide enfilade fire not just against Horus's positions, but against the word-bearers' eastern flank, the positioning of his heavy weapons that would allow them to rapidly shift targets from the fortress complex to the Alpha Legion's northern deployment, the careful spacing that would prevent friendly fire incidents when the moment came to reveal their true allegiance. "Contact with Iron Hands established," reported Captain Harcourt. "They're taking heavy casualties. Ferrus Manus is engaged in personal combat with enemy forces near the primary breach." Perturabo felt something cold settle in his stomach. In the original timeline, the one where the Iron Warriors would have joined the betrayal, Ferrus Manus had died on this battlefield, murdered by his own brother, Fulgrim, while surrounded by warriors he thought were coming to aid him. "All companies, advance at maximum speed," Perturabo commanded. "Iron Hands need support immediately." The Iron Warriors surged forward, their power armor systems screaming alerts as they pushed beyond safe operational parameters. Behind them, Perturabo could see the word-bearers moving to follow, their own forces advancing to what they believed would be perfect firing positions against the Loyalist rear. The moment of truth was approaching with the inevitability of orbital mechanics. In minutes, perhaps seconds, the traitor legions would expect the Iron Warriors to open fire on their supposed allies. When that didn't happen, when Perturabo's warriors instead turned their guns on the true enemies of the Imperium, the carefully orchestrated betrayal would collapse into chaos, and in that chaos, everything would depend on how quickly the Loyalist forces could adapt to a situation they had no reason to expect. "Iron Warriors, this is Ferrus Manus." The voice of the Iron Hands Primarch crackled over the Vox, distorted by weapons fire and atmospheric interference. Your support is appreciated, brother. My position is grid 77 Alpha, central breach. Enemy resistance is... The transmission cut off in a burst of static that could have been equipment failure or weapons fire. Perturabo's enhanced vision immediately zoomed in on the coordinates, and what he saw there made his primary heart skip a beat. Ferrus Manus stood alone in the center of a ring of enemies, his massive hammer, Forgebreaker, rising and falling like a piston as he fought against impossible odds. Around him, Iron Hand's battle brothers lay dead or dying, their black armor cracked and smoking. And moving toward the embattled Primarch with the fluid grace of a predator, Perturabo could see a figure in purple and gold whose identity he recognized with sick certainty. Fulgrim, the Phoenician, the perfectionist, the brother who had always been everything Perturabo was not. Beautiful where Perturabo was functional, beloved where Perturabo was merely respected, inspired where Perturabo was merely effective, and now, apparently, a traitor. All companies, emergency advance! Perturabo roared into the Vox, Iron Hand's Primarch in immediate danger. Execute Olympian protocols now! The Iron Warriors responded as if touched by lightning. Assault squads engaged their jump packs, heavy weapons teams pivoted to new firing positions, and tactical squads opened fire not on the loyalist forces they were supposed to betray, but on the word-bearers who had been moving to support what they thought would be a massacre. The word-bearers' shock was absolute. One moment they had been advancing in perfect coordination with their supposed allies, and the next they were taking fire from warriors who should have been standing beside them. The surprise was so complete that entire squads were cut down before they could even identify where the shots were coming from. But the word-bearers were space marines, genetically engineered for warfare, and mentally conditioned for the impossible. Their shock lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Their retaliation was swift and overwhelming. The eastern flank of the battlefield exploded into violence as two full legions turned their fury on each other. Bolter fire filled the air like deadly rain. Plasma weapons carved trenches through solid rock, and the ground shook with the impact of missiles and grenades. What had been a carefully orchestrated military operation became a close-quarters brawl, where brother fought brother, with the kind of desperate savagery that only civil war could produce. But Perturabo's attention was focused elsewhere. Even as his legion engaged the word-bearers in combat that would determine the fate of the galaxy, he was racing across the broken ground toward the position where Ferrus Manus fought for his life. The Iron Hand's Primarch was magnificent in his fury, but even magnificence had limits. Fulgrim pressed him with inhuman speed and grace, the traitor Primarch's blade weaving patterns that seemed too complex for mortal comprehension. Around them, the bodies of Iron Hand's warriors bore testament to the price of standing between two demigods when they chose to settle their differences with violence. Perturabo arrived at the battle just as Fulgrim's blade found its mark, sliding between plates of Ferrus Manus's armor to draw bright blood. The Iron Hand's Primarch staggered, his grip on Forgebreaker faltering for the first time in the battle. "Brother!" Perturabo's voice carried across the battlefield like thunder, and both combatants turned to see him approaching with his command squad at his heels. "Your fight is with me now." Fulgrim's perfect features twisted into an expression of surprise that quickly transformed into something that might have been relief. "Perturabo, you've come to finish what we started. Excellent timing." Ferrus was proving more stubborn than expected. "Yes," Perturabo said, raising his weapon. "I've come to finish this." The blast from his combi bolter caught Fulgrim's center mass, the mass-reactive shells detonating against the Phoenician's armor with enough force to stagger even a Primarch. Fulgrim's expression of relief transformed into shock, then fury, as he realized that Perturabo was not firing at the wounded Ferrus Manus, but at him. "Traitor!" Fulgrim screamed, launching himself at Perturabo with the speed of a striking serpent. "I was supposed to choose loyalty over spite," Perturabo replied, meeting his brother's charge with Forgebreaker raised in defense. The weapons met with a sound like breaking worlds, and suddenly 2 more Primarchs were locked in combat that would reshape the galaxy. Around them, the battle for Istvan V raged with renewed fury, but now it was no longer the carefully planned massacre that the traitors had envisioned. Instead of loyalist forces caught in a crossfire, it was the word-bearers who found themselves trapped between the Iron Warriors and the surviving elements of the first wave. It was the Alpha Legion who discovered that their carefully prepared positions were now targeting zones for Iron Warriors' artillery. It was the Night Lords who learned that their terror tactics meant nothing when their supposed allies had turned their guns around. The Dropsite massacre had become something entirely different. Not the death of loyalty, but the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where the lines between friend and enemy shifted with each passing moment, where the greatest victories could be won not through superior firepower, but through superior wisdom, where the choice between mercy and vengeance could determine the fate of species. As Perturabo fought his traitorous brother among the wreckage of their shared dreams, he found himself thinking not of victory or defeat, but of a conversation in an observatory, of a sister who had taught him that strength came not from imposing one's will, but from inspiring others to choose cooperation, of the moment when he had learned that sometimes the greatest loyalty required the courage to change. The battle for Istvan V was far from over. But for the first time since the first shot had been fired, Perturabo believed that loyalty might prove stronger than betrayal, that wisdom might overcome spite, that the Imperium his father had dreamed of might survive the crucible of civil war. And somewhere in the chaos of that transformed battlefield, Ferrus Manus raised Forgebreaker once more and rejoined a fight that he was no longer destined to lose. Chapter 7. Brothers in War. The fortress world of Tempest's Edge had been built to withstand the fury of Xenos invasions, Imperial compliance actions, and the passage of millennia. Its architects had crafted defensive positions that could channel attackers into killing zones, walls that could absorb orbital bombardment, and supply networks that could sustain a siege for decades. Those architects had never imagined that Perturabo and Rogel Dawn would be working together to tear it all down. "Third Bastion falls in 17 minutes, Dawn's voice carried across the command vox with the mechanical precision that Perturabo had once found insufferable. Now, after 6 weeks of joint operations, he recognized it for what it was. Not arrogance, but absolute confidence built on absolute competence. "Acknowledged," Perturabo replied, his own tactical display showing the intricate dance of destruction they had choreographed. "Iron Warriors breaching the secondary wall in 15. Your timing is perfect, brother." Brother. The word still felt strange in his mouth when addressed to Dawn, heavy with decades of rivalry and mutual disdain. But watching the Imperial fists work, seeing how Dawn's methodical approach complemented rather than competed with his own innovative solutions, was teaching Perturabo lessons about cooperation that went far beyond military tactics. The fortress world had been held by Word-Bearers' forces for 3 months, ever since the immediate aftermath of Istvan V. The traitors had fortified it with the kind of fanatical thoroughness that spoke of religious conviction rather than military pragmatism. Defensive positions that prioritized symbolic importance over strategic value. Walls decorated with blasphemous iconography that served no function except intimidation. It was exactly the kind of target that would have frustrated either Primarch working alone. Dawn's methodical approach would have ground down the defenses eventually, but at tremendous cost in time and casualties. Perturabo's innovative solutions would have found the weak points quickly, but exploiting them would have required the kind of sustained coordination that his legion had struggled with in the past. Together, they had reduced a 3-year siege to a 6-week, systematic dismantling. Perturabo. Dawn's voice carried a note of something that might have been satisfaction. The northern approach is yours. My compliments on the positioning. I wouldn't have seen that angle myself. The admission was unprecedented. In 4 decades of campaigning side by side during the Great Crusade, Perturabo could not recall a single instance of Rogel Dawn acknowledging that another Primarch's tactical insight exceeded his own. The fact that he was doing so now, and doing so publicly over a Vox channel that dozens of officers could hear, spoke to a transformation that went beyond mere military cooperation. Your preparations made it possible, Perturabo replied, and found that he meant it. The feint on the eastern wall drew their reserves exactly where we needed them. Textbook execution. The exchange was witnessed by officers from both legions, warriors who had spent decades watching their Primarchs compete rather than collaborate. Perturabo could feel the subtle shift in attitude rippling through the command structure. The dawning realization that 2 of the Imperium's greatest siege specialists working in concert could accomplish things that neither could achieve alone. The breakthrough came precisely when their calculations had predicted. Imperial Fist's assault troops poured through the breaches Dawn had carved in the outer defenses, while Iron Warriors' breaching teams used Perturabo's innovative tunnel networks to strike at the fortress's foundations. What should have been a months-long stalemate became a coordinated demolition that left the Word-Bearer's defenders reeling. But it was in the aftermath of the victory that Perturabo found himself most surprised by his brother's evolution. The civilian populations require immediate attention, Dawn announced during the post-battle briefing, his scarred features displaying what Perturabo had learned to recognize as genuine concern. Word-Bearers' occupation policies have been harsh. Medical aid, food distribution, and infrastructure repair must take priority over fortification construction. 6 weeks ago, Dawn's first priority would have been securing the conquered territory through defensive positions and garrison deployment. The fact that he was instead focusing on the needs of the people he had liberated spoke to lessons learned from their collaboration, lessons that went beyond siege tactics to encompass the broader question of what they were fighting to preserve. Agreed, Perturabo said. My engineers have identified 17 critical infrastructure points that require immediate attention. Water purification, power distribution, transportation networks. If we can restore basic services within the week, we'll have willing cooperation instead of sullen compliance. Dawn's expression shifted slightly, a minute change that most observers would have missed, but which Perturabo had learned to interpret as approval. An excellent assessment. Your experience with post-siege administration has been educational. Educational. Coming from Rogel Dawn, the word carried the weight of a transformation. The brother who had once dismissed Perturabo's concerns about garrison morale and civilian infrastructure as unnecessary complications was now acknowledging their strategic importance. Your own adaptations have been equally instructive, Perturabo replied. The integration of humanitarian concerns into tactical planning is more complex than I had realized. More necessary as well. They were interrupted by the arrival of Captain D'Antioch, whose scarred features carried the satisfaction of a warrior who had just overseen a perfectly executed operation. Behind him walked Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists, his yellow armor still bearing scorch marks from the final assault. My lords, D'Antioch reported. Fortress secure. Resistance eliminated or captured. Civilian casualties. He paused, consulting his data slate. Minimal, considering the scope of operations. The preliminary evacuation protocols you established proved effective. Civilian casualties were a priority consideration? Lysander asked, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than criticism. In siege warfare? In all warfare, Dawn replied, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that had once been reserved for discussions of wall thickness and gun placement. Victory means nothing if we destroy what we seek to protect in the process of achieving it. The words could have been spoken by Perturabo himself. Indeed, they echoed conversations he'd had with Caliphone back on Olympia, discussions about the difference between conquering and governing. The fact that they were coming from Rogel Dawn represented a shift in thinking that would have been unimaginable before their partnership began. Intelligence reports coming in from the outer system, Dantioch continued. Multiple word-bearers vessels have translated out-system. It appears they're regrouping at the Maelstrom's edge. Perturabo frowned, calling up his mental map of the sector's strategic positions. The Maelstrom's edge was a collection of fortress worlds that controlled key shipping routes. Taking it would require coordinated action from multiple Legion elements, the kind of complex operation that had been impossible when Loyalist forces were scattered and demoralized. But now, with momentum from Istvan Föfir and growing cooperation between Legion commands, it represented an opportunity rather than an insurmountable challenge. Joint operation? Dawn asked, his tactical mind apparently following the same strategic logic. Joint operation, Perturabo confirmed. But we'll need intelligence on their defensive preparations. The standard reconnaissance approaches won't work. Word-bearers have become paranoid about conventional infiltration since they learned about the intelligence networks. Intelligence networks? Lysander inquired. Perturabo exchanged a glance with Dawn before responding. His experience with negotiated solutions, rather than imposed ones, had taught him the value of maintaining contact with civilian populations on occupied worlds, people who could provide information about traitor movements, supply lines, and defensive preparations in exchange for protection and fair treatment. It was the kind of intelligence network that only existed because he had chosen mercy over vengeance on Olympia, because he had learned to value willing cooperation over forced compliance. And it was proving to be one of the Loyalist cause's greatest strategic advantages. Civilian contacts, he explained. People who have reasons to want the traitors gone, and who trust us enough to provide assistance. The word-bearers' occupation policies have been counterproductive from their perspective. Counterproductive how? Dawn asked, though Perturabo suspected his brother already knew the answer. They rule through fear and ideology, rather than practical governance. Populations that might have remained neutral or even supportive have been driven to active resistance by arbitrary persecution, resource extraction, and religious indoctrination. Perturabo pulled up holographic displays showing supply route disruptions, communication intercepts, and strategic intelligence that painted a picture of traitor forces struggling with internal logistics and hostile civilian populations. Whereas your approach encourages cooperation, Dawn observed. Mutual benefit encourages cooperation, Perturabo corrected. We protect them from traitor occupation. They provide intelligence and support. Simple exchange of value rather than extracted compliance. The briefing continued for another hour, covering logistical preparations, fleet movements, and coordination with other Loyalist elements across the sector. But as the meeting concluded and officers departed to implement their orders, Perturabo found himself walking with Dawn through the captured fortress's command levels. I owe you an apology, Dawn said suddenly, his words cutting through the comfortable silence they had developed over weeks of collaboration. For what? for 40 years of assuming that different meant inferior. Dawn's scarred features were set in the kind of serious expression that Perturabo had learned meant his brother was wrestling with fundamental questions. Your approaches to siege warfare, to post-conquest administration, to intelligence gathering, I dismissed them because they weren't my approaches. I was wrong. The admission was unprecedented, coming from a Primarch whose reputation had been built on absolute certainty in his own methods. Perturabo felt something shifting inside his chest. Not vindication, exactly, but recognition. The kind of acknowledgement he had spent decades seeking from his brothers offered freely now that he had stopped demanding it. "We were both wrong," Perturabo replied. "I assumed that your methods were rigid because you couldn't see alternatives. I was also wrong. Your foundations are strong enough to support innovation. They always were. I was too proud to build on them instead of competing with them." They walked in silence for a few more minutes, passing through corridors that bore the scars of recent battle, but also the signs of immediate reconstruction. Iron Warriors engineers worked alongside Imperial Fists artificers to restore power systems and communication networks, their different specializations complementing rather than competing. "The Emperor will be pleased," Dawn said eventually. "Will he?" The question carried more weight than Perturabo had intended. "I changed the entire strategic balance of the heresy by choosing loyalty over spite. But I also disobeyed direct orders by negotiating with rebels instead of destroying them. I'm not certain how he'll evaluate that balance." "I think," Dawn said carefully, "that he'll evaluate it based on results. And the results speak for themselves." Outside the fortress windows, the lights of the liberated city were coming back online, one district at a time. Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors worked together to coordinate relief efforts, their yellow and iron armor moving in patterns that spoke of genuine cooperation rather than grudging alliance. In the distance, civilian populations emerged from hiding to begin the work of rebuilding their world under Imperial protection rather than traitor occupation. It was, Perturabo thought, what victory was supposed to look like, not just the defeat of enemies, but the preservation and improvement of what was worth defending. "Brother," he said, using the word with genuine warmth for the first time in decades, "I believe we have more work to do." "Indeed," Dawn replied, and Perturabo could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "The Maelstrom's edge won't fortify itself, and I suspect Horus is beginning to realize that his carefully planned rebellion just encountered its first serious opposition." As they planned their next operation, Perturabo found himself thinking not about the enemies they would face, but about the partnership they had built. 6 weeks ago, he and Dawn had been rivals forced together by circumstance. Now they were something far more powerful, brothers who had learned that their differences made them stronger rather than weaker, warriors who understood that true victory required wisdom as much as force. The war was far from over, but for the first time since Horus had made his offer of revolution, Perturabo believed that loyalty, properly applied, might prove stronger than spite, properly organized. Chapter 8. The Hunter Becomes Hunted. The war room aboard the Iron Blood had become a map of loss, painted in crimson warning lights. Perturabo stood before the galactic display, watching red markers bloom across dozens of systems, like wounds opening in the flesh of the Imperium. Each light represented an Iron Warrior's position under attack, a supply convoy destroyed, a garrison overrun by coordinated traitor forces. The pattern was unmistakable in its precision. This wasn't the random violence of a civil war, but a calculated campaign designed to achieve a specific goal, the destruction of the Fourth Legion. "Perdition's Gate falls," reported Captain Harcourt, his scarred features grim as he updated the tactical display. 6th Company overwhelmed by combined Alpha Legion and Word-Bearers forces. Estimated casualties at 70%. Another light died on the display. Perturabo watched it fade and felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not grief exactly, because he had grieved for too many fallen warriors over the past months to have room for more. What he felt instead was the growing certainty that he had become the primary target of a campaign designed not just to defeat him, but to break him. Iron Citadel reports successful defense against Night Lord's assault, D'Antioch continued from his position at the communications station. But they're requesting immediate reinforcement. The attackers withdrew after inflicting maximum terror damage to civilian populations. Classic 8th Legion tactics. Perturabo's enhanced hearing caught the subtle emphasis his lieutenant placed on the final words. Terror damage to civilian populations. The Night Lords weren't trying to capture strategic positions. They were trying to make Perturabo watch helpless as innocents died for the crime of serving under his protection. It was working. How many systems now? Perturabo asked, though he already knew the answer. 17 simultaneous attacks across 12 sectors, D'Antioch replied, all targeting Iron Warriors' positions specifically. No random selection pattern. No strategic logic beyond forcing dispersal of our forces. The mathematics were brutal in their clarity. The traitors had identified his legion as a priority target and were systematically grinding it down through coordinated assault. Not because the Iron Warriors controlled critical strategic positions, though some did, but because Perturabo's betrayal at Istvan V had marked him as an existential threat to their cause. He had chosen loyalty over spite, and now he was paying the price for that choice. The personal communication alert that chimed from his private Vox channel carried an encryption signature that made his primary heart skip a beat. Olympian military frequency, originating from his home world. For a moment, he allowed himself to hope that it was Caliphone, with news of successful defense preparations, or perhaps intelligence about traitor movements in the sector. Instead, the voice that emerged from the speaker was one he recognized, but had hoped never to hear again. Perturabo. The tone carried the kind of oily satisfaction that belonged to someone savoring another's pain. I trust this message finds you. Overwhelmed. Lorgar. The Word-Bearer. Primarch, whose forces had been among the most fanatical at Istvan V, whose reaction to the Iron Warriors' betrayal of their betrayal had bordered on religious fury. Perturabo had expected retaliation, but not direct communication from one of the rebellion's primary architects. I'm listening, Perturabo said, nodding for D'Antioch to begin tracing the transmission while keeping his own voice carefully neutral. Good. I want you to understand what's happening to your precious Olympia, brother. The consequences of choosing the wrong side in this war. The display screen activated, showing a real-time feed from somewhere on Olympia's surface. Perturabo recognized the location immediately. The rebuilt civic center in Locos, the building that had represented everything he'd learned about cooperation and trust. The building where Caliphone held her council sessions with the elected representatives who had helped transform Olympia's governance. The building that was currently burning. The Night Lords are quite thorough in their work, Lorgar continued, with the kind of casual appreciation someone might use to discuss a well-executed painting. Terror tactics applied not for strategic gain, but for pure psychological effect. They want you to know that everyone who ever trusted you, everyone who ever believed in your vision of mercy and cooperation, will pay the price for your betrayal. Perturabo forced himself to watch as armored figures moved through the flames, not Iron Warriors, whose distinctive bulk he would have recognized immediately. but the sleeker forms of Night Lord's estates, methodically ensuring that the building would burn completely. In the background, he could see civilians fleeing through streets that should have been safe under Imperial protection. "Where is Caliphone?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of lethal quiet that usually preceded orbital bombardment. "Oh, she's alive," Lorgar assured him with mock concern. "For now, the Night Lords have specific orders regarding her treatment. She's to witness the complete destruction of everything you built together before she's allowed to join her fellow citizens in death. A fitting tribute to your misguided compassion, don't you think?" The feed shifted to show another familiar location, the observatory where he had made the choice that had changed everything. The ancient dome was intact, but the grounds around it were littered with the bodies of Olympian defense forces who had died trying to protect what they believed their lord would want preserved. "I'm going to kill you," Perturabo said, with the kind of matter-of-fact certainty he usually reserved for engineering calculations. Perhaps, but not quickly enough to save them. Lorgar's voice carried genuine pleasure now, the satisfaction of someone who had found the perfect weapon. "You see, brother, this is what happens when you allow sentiment to cloud strategic judgment. Your mercy made Olympia strong, yes, but it also made it vulnerable. Every connection you forged with those people, every bond of trust and cooperation, has become a chain we can use to drag you down." The screen shifted again, this time showing the space around Olympia itself. In the distance, barely visible against the star field, Perturabo could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Night Lord's vessels maintaining position just outside the system's defensive perimeter. Not attacking the planet directly. That would be simple warfare. Instead, they were conducting terror raids, striking at civilian targets and infrastructure before withdrawing to repeat the process elsewhere. They were teaching the people of Olympia that their lord's protection was worthless, that his mercy had made them targets rather than partners. "You have a choice to make, Perturabo," Lorgar continued. "Return to defend your precious homeworld, and watch our other forces complete the destruction of your scattered legion. Or maintain your current strategic positions while your people learn the cost of trusting in your compassion." The transmission ended, leaving Perturabo alone, with the weight of exactly the kind of impossible decision that defined civil war. Save the people he loved, or serve the cause he believed in. Protect what he had built, or preserve what remained of his ability to build more. Around him, the war room had gone silent. His officers stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to intelligence that was simultaneously a tactical briefing and personal torture. Dantiok's scarred features carried the expression of someone who understood exactly what his Primarch was facing, but who had no wisdom to offer that wouldn't sound like platitude. "Trace results?" Perturabo asked, his voice cutting through the silence with mechanical precision. "Partial. Transmission originated from the Ghoul Stars region, but routing suggests multiple relay points. Impossible to pinpoint origin with current intelligence." Dantiok paused. "My lord, if I may—" "You may not." Perturabo's tone brooked no argument. "Tactical assessment. What happens if we redeploy to Olympia?" 17 positions across 12 sectors become indefensible, Captain Harcourt replied without hesitation. Estimated Legion casualties from coordinated assault during redeployment, 40 to 60%. Strategic impact: Iron Warriors cease to exist as an effective fighting force within 3 months. The mathematics were clear, brutal, and completely accurate. Saving Olympia would destroy his Legion's ability to influence the broader war. But allowing Olympia to burn would destroy something else, the moral foundation that had made him immune to Horus's corruption in the first place. Alternative assessment, Perturabo said quietly. "What happens if we maintain current positions?" "Olympia falls to terror tactics within 2 months," Dantiok replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Civilian casualties in the millions. Psychological impact on Legion morale. Uncertain, but potentially severe. Potentially severe." The careful phrasing of an officer who understood that watching his home world burn might break his Primarch in ways that mere military defeat could not. Perturabo closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember the conversation in the observatory, the moment when Caliphone had challenged him to be the leader Olympia needed, instead of the general the Crusade demanded. She had asked him to choose mercy over vengeance, trust over fear, partnership over dominance. Now the consequences of that choice were threatening to destroy everything he had fought to protect. "Sir," said a voice from the communications station, one of the junior officers whose name Perturabo didn't immediately recognize. "Incoming transmission from Imperial Command. Priority Alpha." The new transmission carried Malcador's encryption signature, and when the Sigillite's face appeared on the screen, Perturabo could see something in his expression that looked like understanding rather than mere strategic concern. "Lord Perturabo," Malcador said without preamble, "we are aware of the situation developing around Olympia. We are also aware of the broader pattern of attacks against your Legion positions." "And?" Perturabo asked. "And the Emperor wishes you to know that your home world's defense is considered a strategic priority equal to any other Imperial position. The Ultramarines are already moving to provide relief, and the Imperial Fists have been authorized to redeploy 2 companies to assist in orbital defense." The words hit Perturabo like a physical blow. Relief from other legions meant that the Emperor understood exactly what the traitors were trying to do. Not just defeat the Iron Warriors militarily, but break them psychologically by forcing their Primarch to choose between personal loyalty and strategic duty. More than that, it meant the Emperor had made the choice for him. "Maintain your current positions," Malcador continued. "Your strategic value to the Loyalist cause far exceeds the symbolic value the traitors hope to gain through Olympia's destruction. We will not allow sentiment to override strategy, but neither will we allow the enemy to believe that mercy is weakness." As the transmission ended, Perturabo felt something shifting inside his chest. Not relief, exactly, because Olympia was still under attack, and Caliphone was still in danger, but something like vindication. The choice he had made to show mercy instead of vengeance was being validated not just morally, but strategically, by an emperor who understood that preserving what was worth protecting sometimes required wisdom rather than strength. "Sir?" Dantiok asked quietly. "We maintain position," Perturabo said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute decision. "And we trust that the lesson we learned on Olympia, that mercy builds stronger foundations than fear, will prove true once again." Outside the viewports of the Iron Blood, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and somewhere among them, Olympia fought for survival under the protection of allies who understood that some things were worth defending precisely because they had been built through choice rather than compulsion. The Night Lords could burn buildings, terrorize civilians, and murder innocents, but they could not destroy the idea that had made Olympia worth saving, the idea that strength came from willing cooperation rather than imposed compliance, that loyalty earned through trust was more powerful than obedience extracted through fear. It was an idea worth fighting for, even when the cost of that fight seemed impossible to bear. Chapter 9. The Siege of Olympia. The orbital defense monitors screamed their warnings into the command bunker beneath Mount Telegonus, and Caliphone felt the weight of an entire world settling on her shoulders. "Enemy fleet translation complete," reported Colonel Andros, his voice tight with the controlled fear of a soldier who understood exactly what they were facing. "Initial count, 47 vessels. Composition, word-bearers, Alpha Legion, and unidentified auxiliaries. 47 ships. Against Olympia's 12-ship defense fleet and orbital installations that had been designed to repel raiders and pirates, not a full-scale Astartes assault. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and facing enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything the planet's defenders had trained to fight. But as Caliphone looked around the command center at the faces of men and women who had chosen to stand with her, rather than flee or surrender, she found herself thinking not about the impossibility of their situation, but about a conversation from months ago, when her brother had asked her to help him understand the difference between ruling and leading. "D'Antioch," she said, addressing the Iron Warrior's captain, who had volunteered to remain on Olympia when the rest of the Legion deployed to critical positions across the sector. "Current defensive status?" "Orbital platforms at full combat readiness," the scarred Astartes replied, his massive form somehow managing to fit behind a command console designed for mortal proportions. "Iron Warriors garrison. 2 companies, reinforced with Olympian defense forces and civilian volunteers. Ground-based artillery, functional and pre-targeted. We can hold for—" He paused, consulting tactical displays that painted a grim picture. "Perhaps 6 hours against conventional assault, less if they deploy Astartes to ground operations immediately. 6 hours, long enough for word of the attack to reach Perturabo, but not nearly long enough for him to return with reinforcements. The traitors had planned this assault with the precision of a siege-breaking operation, maximum force applied at the moment when Olympia was least able to resist, designed to present her brother with the agonizing choice between saving his home world and abandoning critical strategic positions elsewhere. "Communication status with the fleet?" she asked. "Intermittent contact with friendly forces," reported Lieutenant Thanos from the communications station. "But enemy jamming is intensifying. Last confirmed message from Lord Perturabo indicated his position is currently under assault by Night Lord's elements. He cannot return immediately." The words hit the command center like a physical blow. Around the chamber, officers and civilian administrators who had been managing their fear through focus on duty now had to confront the reality that they would face this battle without their lord, without the Primarch, whose presence had always seemed like a guarantee of victory. But Caliphone had spent 20 years watching her brother learn the difference between being needed and being indispensable. The lessons of cooperation and shared responsibility that had rebuilt Olympia's government were about to face their ultimate test. "Then we defend without him," she said simply, "the same way we governed without him. Together." The first wave of enemy shuttles began atmospheric entry 30 minutes later, and from the command bunker's tactical displays, Caliphone could watch the careful choreography of invasion unfolding across her world's surface. Not the chaotic assault of desperate raiders, but the methodical advance of professional soldiers who had planned this operation to achieve maximum psychological impact. The Alpha Legion struck first at communication hubs and transportation centers, not to destroy them, but to capture them intact and use them to broadcast surrender demands to the population. Psychological warfare designed to break civilian morale before the real fighting began. The word-bearers targeted symbols of imperial authority, administrative buildings, monuments, the rebuilt civic centers that represented everything Perturabo and Caliphone had constructed together. Their goal wasn't military victory, but ideological demonstration, proof that cooperation and mercy were weaknesses that could be exploited by those with the will to do what was necessary. But as Caliphone watched the tactical displays update with reports from across Olympia's surface, she began to see something that the traitor forces apparently hadn't anticipated. The people were fighting back. Civilian resistance confirmed in 17 districts, Colonel Andros reported, his voice carrying a note of surprise that mirrored Caliphone's own. Armed civilians engaging Alpha Legion infiltration teams, improvised barricades blocking word-bearers' advances. They're not surrendering. Of course they're not, Caliphone replied, and felt something like pride warming her chest despite the desperate circumstances. They built this world. They're not going to let strangers tear it down without a fight. Through the command bunker's viewing portals, she could see the lights of Lochos, the capital city, where she and Perturabo had first learned to govern through consensus rather than decree. The city was under direct assault from word-bearers' forces, buildings burning as enemy artillery tried to break defensive positions, but the lights were still on. People were still there, still fighting, still refusing to abandon what they had helped to create. "Dantiok," she said, turning to the Iron Warrior's captain. "Your assessment. Can civilian resistance actually impact the battle outcome?" The Skada Starts was quiet for a long moment, his augmented eyes processing data streams that would have overwhelmed unenhanced human cognition. When he spoke, his voice carried the same surprise that Caliphone had heard from Colonel Andros. "Unknown variable in enemy tactical planning," he said finally. "Alpha Legion infiltration compromised by civilians who know the terrain and can identify strangers. Word-bearers' advances slowed by populations that refuse to flee or cooperate. It's not decisive, but it's significant. They planned to face defensive forces, not an entire world that considers itself worth defending. Worth defending. The phrase echoed in Caliphone's mind as she watched the battle develop across Olympia's surface. This was the test that she and Perturabo had never consciously prepared for. The moment when the people of their world would have to decide whether the partnership they had built was worth fighting for, or just a pleasant fiction that would collapse under pressure. They were choosing to fight, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in what they were defending. "Enemy fleet moving to orbital bombardment positions," reported Lieutenant Thanos. "Word-bearers appear to be preparing for planetary assault rather than precision strikes." The threat was clear. If the traitors couldn't break Olympia's resistance through ground assault, they would simply destroy the planet from orbit. Turn Perturabo's homeworld into a burned cinder as a lesson to any other world that might consider cooperation over submission. But before Caliphone could respond to the new threat, the tactical displays erupted with new contact signatures, friendly vessels translating into the system at the edge of scanner range. "Ultramarines fleet elements detected," Dantiok announced, his voice carrying the first note of hope Caliphone had heard from him since the battle began. "And Imperial fists, significant force strength, looks like at least 3 full companies from each legion. Relief forces, the support that Malkador had promised, arriving exactly when the situation seemed most desperate. But as Caliphone watched the new fleet elements move into engagement range with the traitor forces, she realized that the real battle was just beginning. The orbital engagement that followed was unlike anything Caliphone had ever witnessed. From the planet's surface, it looked like new stars being born and dying in the space above Olympia. The brilliant flashes of weapon discharges, the expanding clouds of debris from ships that had been reduced to constituent atoms, the elegant dance of vessels maneuvering for firing solutions while trying to avoid the same fate. But the most important battle was still happening on Olympia's surface, where word-bearers and Alpha Legion forces found themselves fighting not just Iron Warriors and relief troops, but an entire population that had decided their world was worth preserving. "Sector 7 reports word-bearers retreat," Colonel Andros announced, updating the tactical display with markers that showed enemy forces pulling back from positions they should have been able to hold. Civilian militia coordinating with Iron Warriors elements. Combined arms effectiveness higher than projected. Sector 12 confirms Alpha Legion withdrawal to secondary positions, added Lieutenant Thanos. Local population providing intelligence on infiltration routes. Enemy stealth advantage negated by cooperative surveillance. As the hours passed and the battle developed, Caliphone began to understand what was happening. The traitor forces had planned their assault based on standard siege doctrine: overwhelm fixed defenses, break military resistance, occupy key positions, and force surrender through superior firepower. But they hadn't planned for the possibility that an entire world might choose to fight as a unified force, that civilian populations might see cooperation with defenders as more valuable than survival under occupation. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of strength that Perturabo had discovered when he chose mercy over vengeance. The kind of power that came not from imposing one's will, but from inspiring others to choose cooperation freely. The word-bearers could burn buildings, but they couldn't destroy the idea that those buildings represented. The Alpha Legion could infiltrate and sabotage, but they couldn't overcome the simple fact that every civilian on Olympia knew which strangers belonged and which didn't. Most importantly, neither traitor force could comprehend why people would choose to fight for a government that treated them as partners rather than subjects. It was outside their conceptual framework, a strategic variable they had never learned to calculate. Enemy fleet disengaging, Dantioch reported, as the orbital displays showed traitor vessels beginning to withdraw to safe distances. Ultramarines and Imperial fists have secured orbital supremacy. Ground forces beginning evacuation to remaining transports. The battle was ending, not with the dramatic victory of overwhelming force, but with the quiet triumph of people who had refused to abandon what they had built together. Olympia had survived, battered but intact, its population proven in the crucible of combat to be something more than subjects. They were citizens, partners, stakeholders in their own future. But as Caliphone surveyed the damage reports flooding in from across the planet, she understood the cost of that survival. Hundreds of buildings destroyed, thousands of civilians dead or wounded, infrastructure that would take months or years to rebuild. The price of proving that mercy could create strength was paid in blood and fire. Casualty reports? She asked quietly. Preliminary estimates. 4,000 civilian dead, 12,000 wounded, Colonel Andros replied, his voice heavy with the weight of numbers that represented people he had served alongside for years. Iron Warriors casualties. 170 confirmed dead, 312 wounded. Significant, but manageable. 4,000 dead. People who had died because she and Perturabo had chosen to build something worth defending instead of something that would be ignored by enemies. People who had died because they believed in cooperation and partnership enough to fight for it. But as Caliphone looked at the tactical displays showing Olympia still intact, still governed by its elected councils, still home to a population that had proven their loyalty through choice rather than compulsion, she found herself thinking about her brother's words from their conversation in the observatory. Some things were worth fighting for. Some ideas were worth defending, even when the cost seemed impossible to bear. Message from Lord Perturabo, Lieutenant Thanos announced, his voice cutting through Caliphone's reverie. He reports Night Lord's assault repelled, requesting immediate status update on Olympia's defense. Caliphone looked around the command center, at the tired but proud faces of people who had spent 6 hours proving that partnership could be stronger than domination, that loyalty earned through respect was more powerful than obedience extracted through fear. at the tactical displays showing a world that had been tested in the crucible of war and emerged not just intact, but stronger. "Tell my brother," she said, "that Olympia stands, and that its people chose to fight for what we built together. Tell him that mercy created exactly the kind of strength he believed it would." Outside the command bunker, the lights of Lokos were coming back on one district at a time, and the work of rebuilding, again, was already beginning. But this time, it was rebuilding undertaken by people who had proven to themselves and to the galaxy that some things were worth defending precisely because they had been built through choice rather than compulsion. It was the kind of strength that could survive any siege, weather any storm, and endure any test, because it was founded not on fear or force, but on the simple human truth that people would fight hardest for what they had helped to create. Chapter 10. The Iron Cage. Reversed. The world of Sebastus IV had been chosen for its strategic insignificance, a minor forge world on the edge of contested space, valuable enough to justify a military response, but not important enough to warrant massive fleet deployments. It possessed exactly 3 qualities that made it perfect for Perturabo's purposes. It controlled a critical hyperspace junction, it had been recently abandoned by its defenders, and its surface offered ideal terrain for fortress construction. Most importantly, it was exactly the kind of target that would draw the attention of the Night Lords and Alpha Legion elements that had been harassing loyalist positions across the sector. "Final defensive positions complete," reported Captain Dantioch, his scarred features displaying the satisfaction of an engineer who had just completed his masterwork. "All systems tested and operational. The fortress is ready." Perturabo stood atop the central command tower and surveyed what he and Dawn had built together over the past 6 weeks. To any observer, it would appear to be a standard Imperial fortification: walls, towers, gun emplacements, and supply depots, arranged according to established siege doctrine. But appearances, as Perturabo had learned from his brother's meticulous planning, could be deliberately deceiving. The fortress covered 20 square kilometers of carefully prepared terrain, its defensive perimeter incorporating natural choke points that would funnel attackers into predetermined killing zones. But where a standard fortification would present obvious weak points that enemy forces could identify and exploit, this structure contained weaknesses that were entirely artificial, carefully engineered vulnerabilities designed to draw attackers into positions where they could be destroyed with maximum efficiency. "Imperial Fist's elements report ready," added Captain Lysander, his voice carrying across the command vox from his position in the fortress's eastern sector. "All units understand their roles in the operation." The operation? 6 weeks of the most intensive construction project either legion had ever undertaken, building something that was, simultaneously, a fortress and a trap, a defensive position and an execution chamber. The kind of complex engineering challenge that would have been impossible for either Primarch working alone, but which their combined expertise had made not just feasible but devastating. "Rogel," Perturabo said, activating his personal Vox channel. "Status report." "All positions secure," came Dawn's voice, carrying the measured certainty that Perturabo had learned to associate with perfect preparation. "Your innovations have exceeded even optimistic projections. The integration of adaptive defense systems with predictive firing solutions is elegant." Elegant. Coming from Dawn, whose aesthetic sense was entirely subordinated to functional efficiency, the word carried the weight of the highest possible praise. But more than that, it represented acknowledgement of something that neither brother could have achieved alone: the fusion of Perturabo's innovative engineering with Dawn's systematic perfection to create something entirely new. "Your foundations made it possible," Perturabo replied, and meant it. The structural integrity calculations for the underground networks were beyond my capabilities. We've built something that neither of us could have conceived independently. The fortress that sprawled across Sebastus IV's surface was indeed something unprecedented in Imperial military architecture. 20 square kilometers of defensive positions that could adapt their configuration in real time, underground tunnel networks that could channel defenders to any threatened position within minutes, and firing solutions that had been calculated not just for every possible angle of attack, but for every tactical doctrine employed by known traitor forces. It was, Perturabo reflected with grim satisfaction, exactly the kind of impossible engineering challenge he had always dreamed of attempting. And thanks to his partnership with Dawn, it was about to become the grave of the forces that had terrorized Olympia. "Contact on long-range sensors," reported the tactical officer from his position at the command station. "Multiple vessel signatures translating into the system. Configuration suggests Night Lord's fleet elements." "Alpha Legion contacts confirmed," added another officer. "And word-bearer's signatures. Looks like a coordinated assault force. 3 traitor legions. More than enough firepower to reduce a standard fortress to rubble within hours, especially when deployed in the kind of coordinated assault that had characterized recent traitor operations. But the force now approaching Sebastus IV wasn't facing a standard fortress. They were approaching the most sophisticated trap in Imperial military history. "Time to orbital range?" Perturabo asked. 4 hours, 17 minutes, came the immediate response. "Perfect timing. Long enough for final preparations, short enough to prevent second thoughts or detailed reconnaissance that might reveal the fortress's true nature." The traitors had taken the bait exactly as tactical projections had predicted, drawn by reports of a strategically valuable but lightly defended position, unable to resist the opportunity to deal another blow to loyalist morale. "All units, implement Protocol Omega," Perturabo commanded, his voice carrying across every Vox channel in the fortress. "Imperial fists and iron warriors, prepare for coordinated defense. Remember, our goal is not simply to repel the attack, but to ensure that none of the attacking forces survive to report our capabilities." The next 4 hours passed in the kind of focused preparation that Perturabo had learned to associate with the moments before great victories or catastrophic defeats. Weapon systems were brought to full readiness. Defensive positions were occupied by warriors who had spent weeks learning exactly where they needed to be and when, and ammunition stockpiles that could sustain a month-long siege were distributed to positions that would need them for perhaps 6 hours. But the most critical preparations were taking place in the fortress's underground levels, where Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists teams were making final adjustments to the systems that would transform a standard defensive operation into something unprecedented in siege warfare. "Sir," Dantioch reported as the enemy fleet entered orbital bombardment range, "all underground networks report ready. Adaptive positioning systems online. Predictive targeting solutions confirmed for all major approach vectors." "Confirmed ready on all Imperial Fists positions," added Lysander. "Your automated fire control systems are remarkable, my lord. I've never seen anything approach their sophistication." The fire control systems that now governed every weapon in the fortress represented the culmination of months of theoretical work that Perturabo had been developing since Istvan Fürth. Instead of requiring human targeting for individual weapons, the entire fortress could operate as a single integrated system. Thousands of guns and missile launchers coordinated by cogitator networks that could calculate firing solutions faster than any human mind and adjust to changing tactical situations in real time. It was the kind of innovation that emerged from combining theoretical knowledge with practical necessity, the sort of engineering breakthrough that happened when someone with Perturabo's imagination was given the resources and motivation to solve seemingly impossible problems. "First wave deployment confirmed," the tactical officer announced. Night Lord's assault craft approaching from the northern vector. Alpha Legion infiltration teams detected at multiple perimeter points. Word-bearers support elements maintaining orbital positions. The assault began exactly as Perturabo had predicted it would, with Night Lord's forces striking at what appeared to be the fortress's weakest points, while Alpha Legion infiltrators attempted to sabotage defensive systems from within. It was a textbook approach to siege warfare: identify vulnerabilities, exploit them with overwhelming force, break the defender's ability to coordinate resistance. But the weaknesses they were exploiting weren't accidental products of hasty construction. They were carefully engineered kill zones, designed to channel attackers into positions where they could be destroyed with maximum efficiency. Northern Perimeter reports contact, D'Antioch announced, as the first Night Lord's assault craft touched down at what appeared to be an inadequately defended section of the fortress's outer wall. Enemy forces deploying in predicted configurations. Fire control solutions locked and ready. Alpha Legion infiltrators detected at 17 locations, added Lysander. All positions correspond to projections. Defensive teams in position. Perturabo watched the tactical displays as hundreds of dots representing enemy forces moved across the fortress's perimeter, each one following paths that had been calculated and prepared for weeks in advance. The Night Lords were advancing toward breach points that would collapse under them. The Alpha Legion infiltrators were following routes that led directly into ambush positions. The Word-bearers' orbital support was targeting defensive installations that were already abandoned in favor of hidden backup positions. Execute, Perturabo said simply. What happened next redefined the parameters of siege warfare. Every weapon in the fortress opened fire simultaneously, coordinated by cogitator networks that calculated optimal targeting solutions for maximum enemy casualties. Night Lord's assault troops found themselves trapped in kill zones where crossfire from multiple directions made movement impossible and retreat suicidal. Alpha Legion infiltrators discovered that every corridor they had penetrated led to chambers where Imperial fists and Iron warriors waited with weapons ready. But the real devastation came from the fortress's innovative defensive systems. Automated gun emplacements that could track multiple targets simultaneously. Missile batteries that launched warheads programmed to detonate at precisely calculated altitudes for maximum anti-personnel effect. Underground tunnel networks that allowed defenders to appear behind enemy positions that should have been secure. Enemy casualties mounting rapidly, reported the tactical officer, his voice carrying a note of amazement that Perturabo recognized as the reaction of someone witnessing something unprecedented. Night Lord's assault formations broken. Alpha Legion infiltration teams eliminated or retreating. Word-bearers requesting immediate extraction. The battle that should have lasted hours was ending in minutes. The fortress that should have been overwhelmed by superior numbers was systematically destroying an assault force that outnumbered its defenders 3-1. Sir, D'Antioch said quietly, this is beyond anything I've ever witnessed. The coordination, the efficiency, it's not just superior defensive engineering. It's a new form of warfare entirely. He was right. What Perturabo and Dawn had created wasn't just a better fortress. It was a demonstration of what became possible when two of the Imperium's greatest military minds worked together instead of competing, when innovation combined with systematic perfection, when theoretical brilliance merged with practical experience, when brothers chose cooperation over rivalry. Word-bearers' fleet elements withdrawing to safe distance, the tactical officer continued. Night Lords and Alpha Legion ground forces effectively eliminated. Estimated enemy casualties 97%. 97%. The kind of casualty rate that transformed military operations from tactical victories into strategic devastation. The traitor forces that had spent months harassing loyalist positions, terrorizing civilian populations, and conducting psychological warfare against imperial defenders had been not just defeated, but annihilated. "Damage to our forces?" Perturabo asked. "Minimal," Lysander replied from his position with the Imperial Fist's elements. "Fewer than 50 casualties across both legions. The defensive systems performed exactly as projected." 50 casualties against an assault force of thousands. The mathematics spoke for themselves. This hadn't been a battle so much as an execution, carried out with the kind of precision that only came from perfect preparation and flawless coordination. "Rogel," Perturabo said, activating his personal Vox channel. "Congratulations, brother. We've just redefined the parameters of siege warfare." "We," Dawn replied, and Perturabo could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Yes, I believe we have. Your innovations, combined with our foundations, have created something that neither of us could have achieved alone." As the remaining traitor forces retreated from the Sebastus system, and the fortress began the process of returning to peacetime configuration, Perturabo found himself thinking not about the tactical victory they had achieved, but about the partnership that had made it possible. 6 months ago, he and Dawn had been rivals whose competition had weakened both of them. Now they were collaborators whose cooperation had created capabilities that exceeded anything either legion had achieved independently. The choice he had made on Olympia, to listen instead of destroy, to build consensus instead of impose dominance, had taught him lessons that extended far beyond planetary governance. It had taught him that strength came not from individual brilliance, but from willing cooperation. That the greatest achievements required not just vision, but the wisdom to recognize when others could help make that vision reality. And most importantly, it had taught him that choosing loyalty over spite, mercy over vengeance, cooperation over competition, could create possibilities that were literally impossible to achieve through any other means. The war against Horus was far from over, but as Perturabo stood in the command center of the most sophisticated fortress ever constructed, surrounded by the evidence of what became possible when brothers work together instead of against each other, he felt something that had been absent from his life for decades. Hope, not just for victory, but for the kind of imperium that might emerge from victory, one built on the same principles of cooperation and mutual respect that had made Olympia worth defending and this fortress worth building, one worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty. Terror burned beneath a sky the color of spilled blood, and Perturabo stood atop the Bab Bastion, watching the greatest siege in human history unfold across the cradle of mankind. The War Master's forces stretched to the horizon. Millions of traitor Astartes, billions of corrupted Imperial Army soldiers, and war machines that defied rational comprehension. Titans walked among them like metal gods, their weapons carving trenches through the palace's outer defenses. Above, the orbital battle raged with such intensity that debris fell from the sky like burning rain, each piece a fragment of ships that had died in the void, defending or attacking the Emperor's throne world. But it was the sight of his own fortifications that filled Perturabo with something approaching satisfaction, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Southern Bastion reports, successful repulsion of Word-Bearer's assault. Dawn's voice crackled over the Vox from his position at the palace's primary command center. Your overlapping fire zones are performing exactly as calculated. Enemy casualties estimated at 70%. 70%, the kind of casualty rate that broke conventional assault forces and sent them retreating to regroup. But the forces now assaulting the Imperial Palace were far from conventional. They were driven by fanatical loyalty to a cause that promised them godhood, supported by powers that existed beyond the material universe. They kept coming anyway. "Eastern approach holding steady," Perturabo replied, his enhanced vision tracking the movement of enemy forces across terrain that had been transformed into the most sophisticated killing ground in Imperial history. Adaptive defensive systems responding to assault patterns, integration with Imperial fists positions, maintaining optimal efficiency. The fortifications that now protected the Imperial Palace represented the ultimate fusion of everything he and Dawn had learned during their partnership. Not just walls and guns, but an integrated system of defenses that could adapt to changing threats in real time. Underground networks that allowed rapid redeployment of forces. Fire control systems that coordinated thousands of weapons as a single entity. Choke points and kill zones engineered with mathematical precision to maximize enemy casualties while minimizing defender losses. It was, Perturabo reflected with grim pride, exactly the kind of impossible engineering challenge he had always dreamed of undertaking, and thanks to the brotherhood he had built with Dawn, it was proving capable of withstanding the fury of the galaxy's greatest traitors. "Sir," reported Captain Dantioch from his position at the tactical station, "long-range sensors detect incoming priority vessels. Configuration suggests civilian transports with military escort." Civilian transports approaching a besieged world were usually refugees fleeing the fighting, not reinforcements arriving to join it. But as the sensor readings resolved into clearer images, Perturabo felt something warm spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with tactical calculations. The lead transport bore the heraldic markings of Olympia. "Caliphone," he whispered, the word carrying more weight than any strategic assessment or casualty report. The next hour passed in a blur of coordination and preparation as the Olympian Relief Force navigated the orbital battle and made planetfall within the palace's defensive perimeter. Not a large force by the standards of the siege, perhaps 10,000 soldiers and support personnel, but their arrival carried significance far beyond their numbers. These were people who had chosen to leave the relative safety of their home world to fight alongside the man who had shown them mercy instead of vengeance, who had built partnership instead of demanding submission. They had come not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in something worth defending. Perturabo met the transport personally at the landing platform, something he would never have done during the Great Crusade. Then, such a gesture would have seemed like weakness, a Primarch concerned with sentiment instead of strategy. Now, after everything he had learned about the difference between ruling and leading, it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Caliphone emerged from the lead transport in the uniform of an Olympian general, a rank that hadn't existed when Perturabo had first unified the world, created specifically to accommodate her role in defending their shared home. She moved with the confidence of someone who had proven herself in battle, but when she saw her brother waiting for her, her composed demeanor cracked just enough to reveal the relief of someone who had feared she might never see him again. "Hello, brother," she said, using the same words she had spoken during their reunion in the observatory. But now her voice carried the weight of someone who had commanded forces in battle and witnessed the cost of the choices they had made together. "Hello, sister," he replied, and found himself embracing her with a gentleness that would have been impossible before he learned the difference between strength and brutality. "Thank you for coming." "Where else would we be?" she asked, with a smile that carried echoes of the girl who had once sung him to sleep, overlaid with the authority of someone who had led a world through civil war and foreign invasion. "Olympia stands with terror. We've come to help you build something worth preserving." The reunion was interrupted by the kind of priority alert that usually preceded either breakthrough or catastrophe. "Sir," Dantioch's voice carried across the landing platform with urgent clarity. "Emperor's children forces have breached the outer perimeter at Section 7 Gamma. Enemy Primarch confirmed in assault formation. Fulgrim, the Phoenician, the perfectionist, the brother who had once been everything Perturabo was not. Beautiful where Perturabo was functional, beloved where Perturabo was merely respected, and now, according to intelligence reports that defied rational comprehension, something that was no longer entirely human. "Go," Caliphone said, reading the expression on his face with the ease of someone who had known him since childhood. "We'll coordinate with your officers to integrate our forces, build something that lasts." Perturabo nodded and moved toward the combat zone. But as he left the landing platform, he found himself thinking not about the tactical challenge he was about to face, but about the words Caliphone had just spoken. Build something that lasts. It was, he realized, exactly what he had been doing for the past 2 years. Not just constructing fortifications or commanding armies, but building relationships and partnerships that could survive any test. The battle he found at Section 7 Gamma was unlike anything he had experienced during the siege. Emperor's children, forces advanced with a coordination that bordered on supernatural, their movements flowing like water through defensive positions that should have been impregnable. At their head moved a figure that Perturabo recognized but struggled to accept, Fulgrim, transformed into something that retained his brother's perfect features, but radiated an otherworldly malevolence that made reality seem unstable around him. Perturabo! The creature that had once been Fulgrim called across the battlefield, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the merely audible. How fitting that we should meet again in circumstances so similar to Istvan Fey. Though this time, I believe, the outcome will be rather different. The thing that had been his brother moved with inhuman grace and speed, its weapons carving through Iron Warrior's defenders with an efficiency that defied physical laws. Around it, reality seemed to bend. Walls melted, weapons misfired, and even the most veteran Astartes found themselves paralyzed by visions of impossible beauty and terror. "You're not my brother," Perturabo said, raising his weapon with the mechanical precision of someone who had trained for exactly this moment, despite hoping it would never come. "Oh, but I am," the demon thing replied with a smile that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been carved from pure malevolence. "I am everything he could have been, freed from the constraints of mortality and sentiment. As you could be, if you would only accept the gifts our new gods offer." The offer hung in the air between them, like a blade balanced on its edge. Power beyond mortal comprehension. Freedom from the limitations of flesh and doubt. The ability to reshape reality according to his will, to build fortresses that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, to command forces that transcended the merely physical. All he had to do was accept that everything he had built with Caliphone and Dawn and the people of Olympia was worthless sentiment, weakness that prevented him from achieving his true potential. "I've heard that offer before," Perturabo replied, his mind flashing back to the conversation with Horus that had started this entire sequence of events. "And I've learned something since then about the difference between strength and corruption." The battle that followed redefined Perturabo's understanding of warfare. This wasn't combat between mortals using physical weapons, but a clash between fundamentally different approaches to existence. Fulgrim's demon-enhanced abilities allowed him to warp reality itself, turning the battlefield into a canvas for displays of power that transcended normal comprehension. But Perturabo had advantages that the demon thing couldn't calculate. Every time its corruption tried to seep into his mind, he found himself thinking of Caliphone's courage in leading Olympia's defense. Every time its promises of power seemed tempting, he remembered the satisfaction of building something in partnership with Dawn, rather than dominating through fear. Every time its whispers suggested that mercy was weakness, he recalled the strength that willing cooperation had provided during every crisis he had faced. The connections he had forged with other people, the trust he had built, the partnerships he had created, the love he had chosen over spite, proved to be a kind of armor that the demon's corruption couldn't penetrate. Impossible! The creature that had been Fulgrim snarled as its attempts to corrupt Perturabo failed again and again. You should be mine. The resentment, the pride, the desire for recognition, I can see them all in you. Why won't you accept what you could become? Because, Perturabo replied, landing a blow that sent the demon staggering backward. I've learned that what I could become is less important than what I choose to become. The turning point came when the demon thing, frustrated by its inability to corrupt Perturabo directly, turned its attention to the Olympian forces that had just arrived to reinforce the palace defenses. Caliphone and her soldiers, less protected than Astartes against other-worldly influence, began to succumb to visions and illusions designed to break their will to fight. In that moment, Perturabo understood exactly what the price of his loyalty would be. The fortress systems he had built with Dawn included one final capability, a central control matrix that could coordinate all defensive weapons simultaneously, turning the entire palace into a single integrated weapon system. But using it required someone to interface directly with machine spirits that had been pushed far beyond their normal operational parameters, absorbing feedback that would likely prove fatal to whoever made the connection. "Dantiok," he said over the command vox, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had made a decision from which there would be no retreat. "Transfer all command authorities to my personal control. I'm implementing final protocol." "Sir, that's an order, Captain. And—" Perturabo paused, watching Caliphone lead Olympian forces against horrors that should not have existed in any sane universe. "Tell my sister that mercy was the right choice, that building something together was worth any price." The connection to the fortress's central systems was unlike anything Perturabo had experienced during decades of interface with advanced technology. Instead of the clean digital streams he was accustomed to, he found himself immersed in machine consciousness that had been traumatized by constant battle, pushed beyond design parameters by the needs of impossible warfare. But through that tortured digital awareness, he gained control of every weapon, every sensor, every defensive system in the Imperial Palace. For the first time in the siege, the entire fortress operated as its creators had intended, not as a collection of independent strong points, but as a single entity dedicated to the protection of what it contained. The demon that had been Fulgrim found itself facing not just one Primarch, but the focused fury of the most sophisticated fortress ever constructed. Every gun in the palace turned toward its position, every missile battery locked onto its signature, every defensive system coordinated to deliver overwhelming firepower at the precise moment when the creature was most vulnerable. "This is impossible," it screamed, as reality itself seemed to turn against it. "You're killing yourself for sentiment, for weakness." "No," Perturabo replied, feeling his consciousness beginning to fracture under the strain of interfacing with systems never designed for such comprehensive integration, for something worth preserving. The combined firepower of the Imperial Palace, focused through Perturabo's sacrifice, was enough to banish the demon thing back to whatever hell had spawned it. But the cost was exactly what he had known it would be. His enhanced physiology was burning out under the strain of maintaining connection with machine spirits that existed at the very edge of technological possibility. As darkness closed around his vision, the last thing Perturabo saw was Caliphone and her Olympian forces standing unbroken in the aftermath of the daemon's defeat, proof that the choice to show mercy instead of vengeance had created exactly the kind of strength he had believed it would. The last thing he heard was Dawn's voice over the command vox, tight with emotion that his brother rarely displayed. "Target eliminated. Palace defenses holding. Perturabo." A pause. "Thank you, brother. Thank you for showing us what loyalty truly means." As consciousness faded, Perturabo felt something that had eluded him for most of his life, the certainty that he had built something worth preserving, something that would endure because it had been created through willing cooperation rather than imposed dominance. Something that would last not because it was perfect, but because it was chosen. Chapter 12. The Lord of Iron Ascendant. 6 months after the end of the siege, Perturabo stood in the rebuilt throne room of the imperial palace and watched the emperor prepare to enter what might be an eternal vigil. The golden throne rose before them like a technological cathedral, its mechanisms humming with the power needed to maintain the Astronomicon and hold closed the tear in reality that Magnus's folly had created. But where the device had once seemed like a monument to imperial authority, now it looked to Perturabo like what it truly was, a prison constructed from necessity, a throne built not for ruling but for suffering. "The webway must be guarded," the emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what he was sacrificing. "The demons press constantly against the barriers Magnus shattered. If they break through, the human species ends," Perturabo finished quietly. "I understand, my lord." The emperor turned to look at him, and Perturabo was struck by how much his father had aged during the final assault on the palace. The wounds Horus had inflicted during their climactic confrontation were healing, but slowly, and the psychic strain of maintaining Terra's defenses had taken a toll that transcended the merely physical. But there was something else in the emperor's expression. Satisfaction, perhaps. Recognition of something that had been achieved against impossible odds. "You understand more than that," the emperor said. "You understand why this victory was possible, why Horus's corruption failed to break our defenses, why the dream of human unity survived its greatest test." Perturabo nodded slowly. The final battle against Horus had indeed unfolded differently than anyone had expected. The War Master's assault on the imperial palace had been broken not by overwhelming force, but by the simple fact that every defender, from the lowliest guardsman to the mightiest Primarch, had known exactly what they were fighting to preserve. The cooperation between legions that had once been rivals, the civilian populations who fought alongside Astartes because they believed in shared governance rather than imposed compliance. The fortifications that integrated innovation with systematic perfection because two brothers had learned to build together instead of competing. The intelligence networks that had turned traitor advantages into loyalist victories. The tactical doctrine that emphasized preservation over destruction. The simple truth that willing cooperation created strength that no amount of supernatural corruption could overcome. "The Iron Warrior's sacrifice will not be forgotten," the emperor continued, his gaze moving to the augmetic devices that now replaced portions of Perturabo's nervous system. The price he had paid for interfacing with machine spirits beyond normal operational parameters. Nor will the wisdom that made that sacrifice meaningful. The medical procedures that had saved Perturabo's life after his integration with the palace's defense systems had left him changed in ways that went beyond the physical. Part of his consciousness now existed in permanent interface with the technological systems he had helped design, giving him awareness of the palace's defensive status that transcended normal sensory input. It was a form of augmentation that would have seemed like a curse during his younger years, when he had valued his humanity above all else. Now, after everything he had learned about the difference between strength and wisdom, it felt like exactly the kind of transformation that made him more effective at building rather than destroying. "What are your orders, my lord?" Perturabo asked. "No orders," the emperor replied, and Perturabo heard something like paternal pride in his voice. "Requests, suggestions, the same kind of partnership you learned to build with your brothers and your people. I am asking, not commanding, that you serve as master of imperial fortifications, help rebuild what was damaged, help design what must be protected." Master of imperial fortifications. The title carried authority over defensive installations across the entire Imperium, responsibility for protecting the worlds and populations that had proven their loyalty during the heresy's darkest hours. It was exactly the kind of position that Perturabo had dreamed of during his years of rivalry and resentment. Recognition of his expertise, validation of his contributions, authority commensurate with his capabilities. But now, offered freely instead of demanded bitterly, it felt like something entirely different. Not a reward for past achievements, but a responsibility for future possibilities. A chance to build rather than simply fortify, to create rather than merely defend. "I accept," Perturabo said simply. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything in imperial history. Not a celebration of victory through conquest, but recognition of survival through cooperation. The surviving Primarchs, Dawn, Guilliman, Vulcan, Corax, and the others who had remained loyal, stood together not as competitors for the Emperor's favor, but as partners in the massive undertaking of reconstruction. "Lord Perturabo of the Iron Warriors," the Emperor announced to the assembled crowd of military officers, civilian administrators, and planetary representatives who had gathered for the formal recognition ceremony. "Master of imperial fortifications, architect of humanity's defense, builder of what endures." The applause that followed carried notes of genuine respect that Perturabo had never heard before. Not the grudging acknowledgement of someone whose capabilities couldn't be ignored, but the appreciation of people who understood that his contributions had made their survival possible. But the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source. "Brother," Dawn said quietly as the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse. "I wanted you to know, the partnership we built during this war has changed everything I thought I understood about strength and leadership. I would be honored to continue working with you during the reconstruction. Continue working with you, not under your command or in competition with your achievements, but in partnership, as equals who understood that their different approaches made them stronger together than either could be alone." "The honor would be mine," Perturabo replied, and meant it completely. The months that followed passed in the kind of intensive construction work that Perturabo had always found most satisfying, but with a fundamental difference that transformed every project. Instead of building fortifications to impose imperial authority, he was designing defensive systems to protect willing populations. Instead of creating monuments to his own expertise, he was collaborating with other architects and engineers to develop solutions that no individual could achieve alone. Most importantly, instead of ruling through superior force, he was governing through earned trust, the same lesson he had learned in the observatory on Olympia, now applied on a galactic scale. The first major project was the reconstruction of Olympia itself, and when Perturabo returned to his homeworld for the groundbreaking ceremony, what he found there validated every choice he had made during the past 3 years. The cities that had been damaged during the siege were being rebuilt not according to his original designs, but through collaborative planning between imperial architects and local communities. The governance structures he and Caliphone had established were functioning exactly as intended, Not perfectly, because perfection was impossible, but effectively, because they had been built on trust rather than fear. Most telling of all, the population that greeted him at the spaceport included people who had fought in the rebellion against imperial rule, now working alongside Iron Warriors veterans to plan defensive installations that would protect what they had built together. "How does it feel?" Caliphone asked, as they walked through the rebuilt districts of Lochos, observing construction projects that integrated imperial engineering with Olympian craftsmanship. "To see the choice you made in the observatory bearing fruit like this?" Perturabo considered the question carefully. Around them, children played in parks that had been built through cooperative planning. Civilians and Astartes worked side by side on infrastructure projects that served community needs rather than military requirements. Former rebels served as elected representatives in a government that balanced imperial authority with local autonomy. "Like vindication," he said finally. "Not of my capabilities, but of the idea that mercy can create strength that force alone never could." "And the future?" "We keep building," Perturabo replied. "Not just fortifications to hold back enemies, but communities worth defending. Not just compliance with imperial authority, but willing participation in imperial purpose. The same lesson, applied as widely as possible." The final scene of his transformation came 6 months later, in a lecture hall within the newly constructed Imperial War College on Terra. Perturabo stood before an audience of young officers from across the Imperium, future generals and admirals, planetary governors and fleet commanders, the people who would shape humanity's destiny in the centuries to come. The lesson he had been asked to teach was siege warfare and defensive strategy. But as he looked out at the eager faces, waiting for instruction in the technical aspects of military engineering, Perturabo found himself thinking about a different kind of education. "Before we discuss the mathematics of defensive positions and the engineering of fortifications," he began, "I want to tell you about a choice I made 3 years ago on my home world of Olympia. A choice between vengeance and mercy, between fear and trust, between ruling through force and leading through wisdom." He told them about the rebellion that had greeted his return, the rage that had threatened to consume him, the conversation in the observatory that had changed everything. He described the intelligence that had saved the loyalist cause at Istvan V, the partnerships that had made victory possible during the siege, the sacrifices that had preserved what was worth defending. But most importantly, he told them about the lesson that had made everything else possible. "Strength," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with the authority of someone who had learned this truth through bitter experience, "does not come from your ability to impose your will on others. True strength comes from inspiring others to choose cooperation, from building something together that none of you could create alone." He gestured to the holographic displays that showed imperial worlds where reconstruction was proceeding through collaborative planning, where former enemies now worked as partners, where the principles of willing cooperation were creating resilience that mere military force could never match. The choice between spite and loyalty, between vengeance and mercy, between domination and partnership, that choice defines not just your character, but the kind of future you help create. Choose wisely, because the galaxy will be shaped by the consequences of your decisions. As the lecture concluded, and the young officers filed out to begin their own journeys of leadership and responsibility, Perturabo found himself thinking not about the wars that had been fought, but about the peace that was being built. Not about the enemies who had been defeated, but about the allies who had been gained through the simple act of treating them as partners rather than subjects. Outside the windows of the War College, the lights of Terra stretched to the horizon. not just the illumination of a thriving world, but the symbol of an empire that had learned to survive through cooperation rather than mere conquest. An empire that had discovered, at the cost of unimaginable suffering, that the greatest victories came not from imposing one's will, but from inspiring others to choose participation in something larger than themselves. It was, Perturabo reflected, exactly the kind of future he had dreamed of building during those long nights in the observatory, when a sister's wisdom had taught him that mercy could be stronger than vengeance, that trust could be more powerful than fear, that the choice to listen instead of destroy could change not just a single world, but the destiny of an entire species. The Lord of Iron had indeed ascended, not to godhood through corruption, but to wisdom through compassion. And in that ascension, he had helped elevate everyone around him to possibilities they had never imagined possible. The war was over. The building could begin,